good morning, everybody. Good morning. Yeah, sound better than that. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
All right, welcome to the 2023 Black Legislative Agenda Day. My name is Adam Jackson, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. This is our 10th year doing Black Legislative Agenda Day. And so typically it starts like this, a dedicated few that come on time, and then folks roll in and out throughout the day. So we really appreciate you coming for the earlier part of today's conversation about what's going to be happening during the 2024 Maryland Legislative Assembly, and also a bunch of other legislative work that folks are working on during the year. Before I sit down, I want to make sure you do a couple things. First, if this is your first time interacting with LBS, first off, welcome. And if you are interested in the work that we do consistently post and talk about what our work on our website on lbsbaltimore.com. There's a lot of op-eds and written information that you can kind of get in case you have any questions about what's happening today. We do provide a lot of long-form written content that you can consume after today's conversation. And part of the reason why we do this, because we're an independent Black think tank, is because we see ourselves as operating in the political arena as an independent Black voice. And a lot of our peers, in many respects, don't really have the opportunity to speak the way we speak because we're not controlled by the political establishment, controlled by nonprofit organizations, controlled by foundations, or any other political entity. And so as a for-profit entity, we rely on people investing in our organization on a monthly basis. And so if you are impressed by what you hear today, I invite you to become a sustainer on our website, lbsbaltimore.com. And if you want to find out how to do that, you can come find me afterwards. But our work is funded by Black people, empowered by Black people. That's why we can do work like this every day for Black people. And so I just want to invite you to do that in case you're interested in doing that after today's event. So I'm going to have a seat, but I'm going to invite up for the first half of our program, Mr. Ray Baker, who's going to be our moderator. And then we'll go into the second part of today's conversation, which will be a panel discussion with legislators. So I'm going to bring up Ray to get us started. Let's give him a hand clap.
Thank you, Brother Adam. I appreciate the opportunity to speak in front of a microphone. Some of us are honest about our outgoings. I appreciate the opportunity to always be in service to Black people. And so I'm grateful for that. So we're going to have a great day today. Everybody stand up for a second. Come on, because we really want to stand up. Let's reach them arms up in the air. Like this a little bit. Yeah. Reach out like this. Yeah. Look to the person on one side. Say good morning. Come on. To the other side. Say good morning. All right. Let's go. Let's take a seat. There we go. All right. Yeah. The reason that we want to get engaged in some activities is because in everything that we do, we're in the process of building community. And if you're sitting near or by someone and they are a stranger to you, then you cannot collaborate with them. You cannot build with them. Their interests are not your interests. Their needs are not your needs. Their wants are not your wants. And the purpose of what we're doing here is to build upon that community, and this is how we're going to get it done. There's a lot of impactful information that we're going to receive today. And the ultimate goal is to be able to take in this information and move forward with this upcoming legislative session and turn it to activists in our own right. So our goal is not just to know things for the sake of knowing them, but instead our goal is to know them to build upon action. So please let us receive this intellectually, but also receive what we're having emotionally. Ashe? Ashe. See, I know I can say Ashe. Y'all know what to do with that. Ashe? Ashe. Appreciate y'all. We're going to get started first with a reparations presentation by LBS's own Lawrence Grand Prix. Lawrence.
Y'all hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
All right. So I'm going to talk about reparations, both the work we've done, the work we are hopefully going to do, and why it matters. So what are reparations? There's obviously some debate about this. People have different visions, but our vision of reparations explicitly comes out of Pan-African liberation struggles. So if you look at a scholar like Cheikh Diop from Senegal, his book, Black Africa, he talks about creating institutions, actual assemblies that are led by women in memory of the matrilineal legacy of African leadership on the continent of Africa. So this is about creating civilizational machinery needed for nation management. And what's happened is that we've limited our vision of reparations in some cases to integrating Black people into institutions owned and controlled by the very people who caused the harm in the first place. So an example of the limitation of this is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. So Ron Walters former professor at Howard, wrote in the book, Pan-Africanism and the African Diaspora, that we have this emotional notion of reconciliation, specifically truth and reconciliation in South Africa, as a unifying of the oppressed and the oppressor, recognizing mutual harm and overcoming their differences. He challenges that narrative and says what he saw was a show particularly designed to convince Western nations that the new Black-controlled South Africa was safe to be brought into the new neoliberal order, to get access to trade. And also, importantly, the reconciliation component was used to obfuscate or to overshadow legitimate calls for wealth and land redistribution in an independent South Africa. So for us, it's important to not let the emotional need for reconciliation, well, there is a desire for Black people to have their pain recognized, but that cannot be the political basis for an effective reparations program. So conversely, we challenge that reparations should not be centered on repairing the damage between the oppressed and the oppressor. Why did every Democratic candidate have a reparations plank in their platform? If this is a radical demand. If you look at what they actually proposed, we argue there was largely a handout to what we call the nonprofit industrial complex to really continue to benefit off of managing the suffering of African people, not to alleviate that suffering. And not to create independent institutions to allow us to choose for ourselves how to control our destiny. So as opposed to that notion, we use this understanding of the Pan-African radical tradition to argue that reparations as a political project cannot be centered on repairing the harm between the oppressed and the oppressor, even though Black people deserve that. It's about creating a recreation of the systems of flourishing that were damaged, so that those who were harmed no longer need to depend on the people or institutions of those who caused that harm. And that was the political theory that led us to do our work around reparations for war on drugs. So some of you might know some of the work we've done. I'll give an overview. We knew Maryland was going to legalize cannabis. We knew they were going to tax it. And we knew, because of the war on drugs, it wasn't just enough to put tax money into the government and hope we got some good programs. We need to explicitly have local control over that money so that the people on the ground can have meaningful political say over where that money goes. So the idea is that the money goes to localities, Baltimore City PG, and others based upon the percentage of people who were arrested for cannabis over a 10-year period. But not only that, we did not want the money only to be, the decision-making power over who got the money to be in the hands of people appointed by political leadership. And that's the governor, the mayors, the county executives, the leader of the Senate, the leader of the House. In other states that did this, decision-making power was almost exclusively centered in people appointed by political leadership. So we were adamant that there needs to be local control, and that while there has to be some political involvement, we picked the places that had the most possibility for bottom-up grassroots influence, which for us was the city council people and county council people. So every locality had to pass a bill saying who controlled the money. And in Baltimore City, we passed a bill saying we have a reparations commission, where city council people have to appoint people based upon certain criteria, knowledge of the indigenous political, cultural practices of communities impacted by the war on drugs, specifically African people, as the criteria who was going to be selected. And Prince George's County just passed a very similar version of that bill. So that's one of the largest pots of money for Baltimore City, explicitly called reparations in the country. And it's one of the largest pots of money anywhere that is explicitly not appointed by party leadership. So we want to build upon that methodology to push a progressive taxation agenda for the entire state of Maryland that reflects this Pan-Africanist vision of reparations. So in the time I have left, I want to outline briefly what's in the bill. We're going to put handouts on our website that explain these in more detail, but the idea is to use this theory of economic redistribution of wealth and equity and progressive taxation, but include what is often excluded from that proposal, an explicit demand that we don't just increase taxes, but invest in community containers, political institutions that are controlled by people who are actually most impacted by these issues. So as we all know, or many of us might know, this state needs money. We've made a big commitment to education. Maybe if you heard the light rail shut down, $3 billion deficit in the transportation budget. So typically in these instances, they have a coalition where Black folks are brought in, our issues are presented as a reason to increase revenues and taxation, but we aren't actually given a meaningful concession in terms of institutions that we actually control that are produced from that increase in taxation. Which is like some people to say, what's the point? We don't ever see any impact, right? So we want to demand investment in the containers that are produced by our cannabis reparations work and being able to expand that work from a couple of dozen $1 million a year to maybe, something more expansive than that, far more expansive, because we know $10 million a year is not enough. Nothing, no monetary figure can ever truly be enough. But we actually need to go into the overall pot of money in this actually very rich state to do meaningful economic redistribution. So some examples of what is going to be on the table that we are presenting is increasing the income tax. Maryland has state income tax, but the highest bracket starts at $250,000. So whether you make $250,000 in $1 or $25 million in income, you pay the same tax rate. So by creating progressive brackets that actually account for distinctions in income, you can create up to $600 million a year in tax revenue for the state of Maryland. Some of you know that stocks, bonds, these are capital gains. This isn't traditional income. This is money accrued by the stuff you own, money accrued by wealth. These capital gains are actually not taxed to reflect the fact that these are the wealthiest people that are making money off these capital gains. So by adding a surcharge to capital gains income, we can raise another $100 million. Some of you might know about the so-called death tax, the tax you pay when you transfer your estate to a loved one or someone in your family. Really, only the richest people pay that, but part of conservative propaganda has got everyone to think that anytime you get grandma's house, you're going to be taxed out the whatever, right? So by reestablishing the estate tax and making folks who have these multi-million-dollar estates pay their fair share, we can get up to $800 million per year in revenue. Now, based upon our story of reparations, what are we going to do with that? Part of this is that folks who were harmed shouldn't have to pay for the repair. So the entirety of this tax burden will fall upon the top 20% of earners in the state, but we also want to expand the state's earned income tax credit. So some of you might know in your federal tax return, you get a chunk of money back if you have kids. If you're a middle income family, the earned income tax credit. We want to expand the state version so that people are actually getting some cash if they're a working family in the state of Maryland. So that's the cash component of it, to an actual pragmatic existing mechanism that people can expect cash realistically, and that goes to people who need it most. Similarly, we want to ensure that as big of a chunk of money as possible goes to actually adding capacity to these local containers that we created through the Cannabis Reparations Fund. And part of the difference is that they are not just designed to facilitate traditional human social service programs. We explicitly said that people need to have the flexibility to choose for themselves what they want to do. So if they want to do housing, if they want to do business incubation, if they want to do capacity building for small grassroots organizations, that needs to be on the table, but that costs money that people would rather spend doing something that looks flashy, doing something that might look good, but may not have the impact of actual reparations. If you think about the war on drugs or the nature of poverty in our community, many of our institutions don't have the 501c3s, the 3 years of audited financial statements, the connections to elite universities to do program evaluations, all the things that get you money in the nonprofit industrial complex in the way we do state funding. Leaning on those things, as other states have done, is kind of the opposite of a reparations methodology, where you need to actually go to the people who are most in need, build them up, and make it so that they can actually expand the good work they're doing on shoestring budgets. So in the last couple of minutes, I just want to say that despite the demand for money, this bill may not pass this year. There's going to be a lot of people questioning our methodology for raising income, because they're going to say, hey, these local institutions, they're not proven. They could waste the money. They could steal the money. Let's just go with the larger package and not include this investment. And I just want to stress for everybody that part of our methodology, because we are not grant dependent. We've been talking about reparations for war on drugs since 2015. The money's probably not going to hit the ground until 2024, 2025. There are no 10-year in the nonprofit world. But because we are independent, funded through grassroots donations and entrepreneurial, we have the ability to sit on the issue for a decade until it actually becomes what it needs to be, but also not succumb to that constant demand to please just join the coalition. Please sublimate or please ignore your needs of your community to just join the larger coalition. And there's going to be a lot of push on that. There's going to be bills produced by other entities to fund the education program, to fund transportation that do not have explicit commitments to community-controlled institutions that reflect the reparations platform. And in this so-called progressive state, in this state where we know that we've suffered the most through all of these issues, not even to talk about the legacy of slavery, we need to be able to have the appetite for the patience to politically demand genuine investments in our self-determination. So that's why we're here. That's why we're talking about this. And we're willing to have that patience to work until the bill actually is something worth passing. So thank you all. Q&A now or later? Okay, yeah, we'll do Q&A then.
I do want to invite everyone to make sure they take notes or write down any of their thoughts, questions, or observations about any of the presentations that you see. Because following the presentations that we have before our break, we are going to have a formalized Q&A with all of our presenters. So if there's something specific, a question, and we're going to try to move away from comments because we do want to be respectful for time, we'll have opportunities to converse interpersonally. But if there are specific questions that you might have that might illuminate your understanding, please be sure to jot it down and make a note so we can come back and revisit it. The next presentation we will have will be from our folks from CASA of Maryland. So we're going to have a presentation from our folks of CASA from Maryland. We're going to move that out of order. Come on, y'all stop playing like y'all don't know how to move impromptu. Or maybe you can hear freestyle, somebody else going to tell you. All right, the next group that we have, we're going to hear from our folks from the Job Opportunities Task Force. Our folks from the Job Opportunities Task Force. Let's welcome you to the podium.
Hey, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So if any of you are unfamiliar with the Job Opportunities Task Force, basically we're a nonprofit workforce development organization that helps underserved communities get access to high-paying and well-paying jobs and careers. So we have 5 major legislative initiatives that we're going to be pushing in this upcoming legislative session. The first one has to do with driver's license suspensions for child support arrears. So as many of you probably already know, if you have child support arrears, if you're late on your child support payments, the state can suspend your driver's license. Now, if we're trying to get money for the kid, why would taking their parents' ability to get to work make any type of sense? That's a barrier to employment that ultimately will do the exact opposite of what they're actually trying to do. So we're looking to put in the bill that basically says, if you make 250% above the federal poverty level, which is approximately $37,000, the state cannot take away your driver's license for child support arrears, because there are some people who simply are unable to pay to make the child support payments. It's not that they're trying to avoid it, it's just that they simply cannot pay. So we're not trying to take those people who are already suffering and possibly impoverished and make it even harder for them to make the payments and maintain their employment. So that is the first thing. The second thing that we're going to reintroduce, this was a bill that we introduced last year. This is good cause expungement. Now, some of you may be familiar with the REDEEM Act that just passed this past session. So basically it cut down the waiting times to have your records expunged. The current law, I believe, it's 5 years for nonviolent misdemeanors and 7 years for non-violent felonies. So that was a positive. We were fully supportive of that bill, and that was a good thing. But at the same time, life doesn't pause in those 5 years or 7 years when you're waiting for your record to be expunged. You still might be trying to get into school, get a job, get a loan, get an apartment, whatever it may be. And because the waiting limit hasn't expired yet, it'll still affect you over those 5 years or those 7 years. So we're hoping to put in a provision that would basically allow you to petition a judge on the basis of good cause. And basically it puts the onus on the individual to be able to go in front of the judge and be like, hey, listen, I made a mistake in the past. I've been clean. This is the reason why I should be granted an exception, and I shouldn't have to wait the full 5 or 7 years. And it's an undue burden for me to have to wait for that whole period. So basically, it just creates an alternate avenue for people to be able to plead their case in front of a judge and be like, hey, listen, this is my situation. Could you please grant me an exception? And we understand that everybody's situations are different. And there are certain instances where some people will need an exception to the rule. So another piece of legislation that we're putting forward has to do with digital literacy education. So as we all know, just technology is just taking off at an absolutely rapid pace. And the average stay in a Maryland prison is roughly 8 years. So you have people that are coming out of prison or correctional facilities, and they're now essentially unemployable because they don't know how to use Zoom, or Microsoft Suite just updated, or they don't know how to use Microsoft Outlook. And as we know, one of the #1 causes for recidivism is inability to maintain employment. So we're looking to introduce a bill that would basically elevate the level of digital literacy training for people in the Maryland Correctional occupational and transitional programs. They already have digital literacy and computer technology components in the curriculum, but it's basic keyboarding, like things of that nature. Like it hasn't actually kept up with the speed in which technology is advancing. So we're hoping to put in a provision to update that and have that curriculum mandated by law to be updated every 5 years to keep pace with technology. So another bill that we're looking to introduce has to do with repealing prison phone calls, fines and fees. So as I'm sure many of you know, like it costs a significant amount of money to be able to have a 15-minute phone call with a loved one for incarcerated individuals. And just from a moral standpoint, that is just absolutely disgraceful. Like it shouldn't be where you have to make a like monetary sacrifice just be able to have a connection with a wife, boyfriend, child, aunt, uncle, grandparent, whatever it is. So we're looking to completely repeal prison phone call fees for state correctional facilities, county correctional facilities, prisons, and jails, and also bake into the bill the infrastructure to be able to do that without too much of a disruption. So the last piece of legislation we're looking to introduce has to do with occupational licenses. So between 2014 and 2018, there was over 600,000 occupational licenses that were given out in the state of Maryland, but people with criminal records only got about 800 of those, which is like 0.13%, like less than 1%. And the question for that is why? Because about 60% of like low-income careers do require occupational licenses. So individuals that are coming out having served time, like it makes sense that that would be a path that they would go to. So why is it that nobody's applying? Odds are it's because they assume that because of their record, they won't be able to get the license. So specifically, we're looking to have it clarified and basically reassure people who are coming out of incarceration, if they are eligible, we need to make sure that they know they are eligible and that they don't assume that they can't get it and not even try. And we also want to put the burden of proof back on the state and licensing boards so that if, for whatever reason, they do feel like an individual should not be able to get a license because of their record, the burden is on them to explain why. And yeah, that is pretty much everything. I got questions at the end, correct?
Yeah, questions.
All right, thank you, everyone.
A lot of good information, a lot of good work happening here. Next, we're going to hear from our folks from ACLU of Maryland. That'll be Annette Emanuel and Frank Patinella. Let's welcome them to the podium.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Annette Emanuel, and I'm the Public Policy Director with the ACLU of Maryland. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our legislative priorities relating to criminal justice this session. So for starters, in 2021, the Maryland General Assembly removed the governor from the parole process, which finally eliminated the politicized process of allowing governors to overturn parole decisions for Marylanders serving life imprisonment sentences. However, due to a drafting error that excluded medical parole, this leaves medical parole being the only type of parole that still requires gubernatorial approval. And this is serious because it is arguably most critical for Maryland's Parole Commission to be able to act quickly when a parole candidate is seriously ill or dying. So this legislative session will be reintroducing a bill that will make this technical fix. This bill passed the Senate last year but was stalled in the House. So we're hoping that with all of your support, we'll get this bill through this session. Another bill that we're working on this session is a bill to eliminate criminal penalties for marijuana-related offenses. So as you all know, last year, Marylanders approved a referendum to legalize the recreational use of marijuana. However, under current law, marijuana-related offenses such as possession with intent to distribute and possession over 2.5 ounces still carries misdemeanor penalties. And we believe that these should be treated as civil offenses rather than with criminalization. Keeping these offenses has zero benefit to public safety, especially because the vast majority of people who are currently selling marijuana are substance dealers selling to survive. They don't make a whole bunch of money and profit and will not have access to a license to distribute marijuana lawfully. However, having these criminal penalties on the books, however, will continue to perpetuate a troubling pattern of disproportionate arrests by police targeting Black and brown people. And with higher conviction rates, Black and brown people will bear the brunt of the collateral consequences stemming from misdemeanor convictions, which includes which hinders a person's access to employment, stable housing, a range of public benefits, and can also bar people from residing in certain homes and exclude them from low income, and exclude those with low income from utility payment plans and food stamps. And without gainful employment and stable housing, people are often forced into livelihoods based on criminal activity. And it's unfair to continue to levy any kind of punishment against them when wealthy Marylanders are going to be able to do the exact thing legally and for a profit. So for that reason, we believe that marijuana legalization should not only address past harms, but also prevent future disparities from happening as well. So this session, we'll be working with leaders of A Beautiful Struggle again this year to reintroduce this bill to treat, again, these eliminate these criminal penalties and treat them as civil citations instead. Next, we're also going to be working on the Maryland Second Look bill. So as you all are aware, Maryland incarcerates the highest percentage of Black people in the entire country at 71% of our prison population, which is more than twice the national average. And Maryland also leads the nation in sentencing young Black men to the longest prison terms at a rate of 25% higher than the next nearest state, which is Mississippi. These facts underscore a pressing and deeply troubling racial justice issue within Maryland's criminal legal system. And the only way to actually reduce the existing racial disparities is to create more meaningful avenues for people to come home. Which is why this session, the ACLU, alongside the Maryland Second Look Coalition, is supporting the passage of the Maryland Second Look Act, which seeks to address Maryland's extreme race disparities and advance public safety by allowing those with extreme sentences who have served at least 20 years the opportunity to petition the court to modify or reduce their sentence based on their demonstrated rehabilitation. And this evidence-based initiative recognizes the transformative potential of focusing on rehabilitation and the urgency of addressing racial justice in our criminal legal system. And this effort is extremely important because the status quo does not afford meaningful opportunities for release. The devastating lock them up and throw away the key mentality from the last 30 years led to harsh changes in law and policy, as we are aware. And Maryland judges actually used to have the ability to review these extreme sentences prior in 2004, which is an extremely important safety valve for extreme sentences. But this process was actually eliminated by a rule change in 2004. And for more than 25 years, Maryland's parole system was not available to people serving parole sentences, which contributed to a bloated prison system and extreme racial disparities that we're seeing today. And now the governor is finally removed from the parole process for the most part, but this is still not enough to remedy the harm of the decades of wrongful denials. And unlike court hearings, another reason why the second look process is really important is that parole is not a judicial hearing, which means that most people have no due process rights or legal representation, and which really prevents them from being able to have a strong presentation. Whereas through a court modification process, they would be able to have an attorney and due process rights. And equally important is that in the immediate aftermath of a serious harm, emotions are high, and it may be difficult for a sentencing judge to determine a person's capacity for change. But many years later, a judge can assess the person's growth, progress, and review their track record inside. And this is extremely important because disturbingly, Maryland's prison system is filled with Black people who are excessively sentenced or denied parole based on the super predator methodology. And a broad second look provision ensures that decades after the crime, sentences can be reviewed based on our current understanding of fairness and racial justice. So for a lot of reasons, we believe this bill represents a vital step towards justice, especially for those who've encountered bias in their interactions with law enforcement, the courts, and corrections. This bill will be a big lift, take a couple of years to pass, but I think collectively, all of us working together will be able to get it done. Lastly, I'm going to talk about the statewide police accountability bill that we're working on. So as you all are aware, in 2021, the General Assembly passed the Maryland Police Accountability Act of 2021. Among other provisions, the bill mandated that Maryland's 23 counties and Baltimore City form a new community police oversight bodies called police accountability boards. And the purpose of these boards is to provide external oversight over the internal police disciplinary process. And the large part of implementation was left up to local jurisdictions, allowing them to outline additional powers and procedures. And among these, we believe should be independent investigatory powers and subpoena powers, which are an essential part of how police accountability boards can fulfill their mission. However, despite strong community support, along with the research and best practices showing that independent investigatory powers are critical to community oversight boards, no PABs across the state currently have independent investigatory powers. This is largely because of threats of lawsuits from the Fraternal Order of Police. And so currently, police accountability boards that administrate and charging committees rely solely on internal police investigations when conducting reviews and deciding whether or not to charge an officer for misconduct. And the main problem is that the state law is unclear, and so local jurisdictions have been hesitant and also again threatened by lawsuits by the FOP to authorize these powers for their boards. And again, as we mentioned, it's critically important that these boards have these powers in order to provide true oversight to the community. And what we've seen time and time again is police conducting lackluster investigations, not investigating properly, conducting not interviewing all the witnesses they should be talking to, losing evidence, or not conducting investigations in a timely manner. And so in order for the police to trust the outcome of these investigations, these boards must have these independent investigatory powers. And so this session will be again supporting a bill that will clarify the law and explicitly say that local jurisdictions, if they so wish to do so, can grant these boards these independent investigatory powers. So we're also this session preparing to do defense work. As you all have heard, also we've heard threats of repealing the Child Interrogation Protection Act and the Juvenile Justice Reform Act, which the next set of panels will be talking to, so I won't talk too much about it, but we are anticipating those threats this session and are preparing to defend against them, and we'll definitely need all of your support to do so. And so with that is the conclusion of my presentation. I'll call up my colleague Frank to come up and welcome any questions later on.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and a big shout out to LBS for everything they do. I'd like to start by giving a quick overview of where we are right now in public education in our state and our city before we get into a couple of legislative issues. A few years ago in 2021, the General Assembly passed a huge $3.8 billion education reform plan called the Blueprint for Maryland's Future. And we're in the second full year of implementation. And I say reform because that's how it's being characterized. But if you look at what the plan includes, the plan is mostly about funding to increase teacher salaries, expand pre-K for 3 and 4-year-olds, more tutors and academic supports for struggling learners, more funding for mental and behavioral health, and modernizing the college and career readiness pathways. This $3.8 billion will be added on top of what the state already gives now to education to implement the plan. But the measures of success are still solely based on what the state has already adopted into their standards. So from our perspective, the focus is still on standardized test scores, graduation rates, suspension rates, and those kinds of metrics. The plan does not really change anything about the pedagogical approach to teaching and learning that happens in the classroom. And more directly stated, the plan does not put any real focus on approaches and models of educating Black children and Latinx children and other underserved populations. Everyone knows that our schools have not served these populations well. While this plan was being developed, there was no attention paid to the whitewashed curriculum, no real consideration was given to how education can be culturally and racially responsive, and approaches that are designed to help Black and brown children understand and process the history of their communities, develop critical consciousness, and their current day lived experiences. So while we support the need for more funding and programming, we see that schools are lacking a foundation rooted in equity. And it's going to take a lot of work and a large groundswell, a large movement over the long term to make significant transformational change to our schools. But there are meaningful things that we can do to address some of the big flaws in our education system in the near term, and things that we can do to prevent certain bills from passing that would do more harm to Black and brown children. This year, there are two bills that we'll be working to pass. The first is called the Commission on History, Culture, and Civics in Education. This is House Bill 890 from last year, sponsored by Delegate Gabriel Acevedo. And it would establish an appointed commission of experts to study and make recommendations to the academic curriculum on the subjects of history, social studies, and civics. The focus will be looking at the gaps in our curriculum and develop content related to the contribution of Indigenous tribes, African Americans, Latinx people, Asian Americans, women, and the differently abled community, and the LGBTQ plus community. If passed, the commission members would have experience in the classroom and or with curriculum development. Commissioner nominees would be put forward by the Black Caucus, the Latino Caucus, Asian and Pacific Islanders Caucus, and appointed by the governor. Other appointed members would include representation from Maryland's Indigenous American tribes, the LGBTQ plus community, and the differently able community, and a couple from higher ed institutions. It's important to note that the commission will not have the power to mandate any curriculum changes. They can only offer recommendations for the State Board of Education to deliberate upon and hopefully adopt into standards. One of the big challenges here is that the legislature, when we talk to legislators about this, they say that they don't get involved with curriculum issues, and they don't do anything to undermine MSDE's, the State Department of Education's authority on curriculum. Number one, they have done that before on a number of curriculum standards that are currently in regulation. But also, this bill does not mandate the State Department of Education to do anything, right? This is a commission of experts that would be making recommendations to the State Board. So, with a big groundswell of grassroots advocates calling for this kind of change, I think we can be successful. This bill hasn't passed. This bill's failed actually 3 times in a row, but we've helped to build up the support around this bill, and hope to make it bigger this year. The second bill is House Bill 1211 from 2023. It's called the Neighborhood Tiers System. The bill is sponsored by Delegate Stephanie Smith and developed by our previous superintendent, Mohammed Chaudhry. You probably heard that he was pressured to step down from his post recently. And it's really unfortunate because I haven't met anyone at that level with a better grasp and boldness on developing proposals that go deep in equity. And even without him, this bill will be filed again. And essentially, it's a funding bill that would add several $100 million to the total cost of the blueprint, which as of now is only half funded. So, it's unlikely to pass this year, but it's important to support because this bill applies a new methodology to how funding is directed to students living in poverty. Right now, the state education funding formula gives more per pupil funding to students living in poverty. And right now, the state determines a child's income status by free and reduced meal forms or enrollment in a federal program such as Medicaid. So under the current funding system, a student living in Howard County, whose family makes $49,000 a year, gets the same amount of funding as a student living in a household that makes $15,000 a year. Living in Baltimore City neighborhood with rows of vacant housing, shuttered recreation centers, and the state sees no difference between those children. So if the tiers bill passes, the funding formula would see the depth of poverty which each students live by using census block data that considers things such as the number of single parent households or average household income of that census block area, rate of home ownership, and collective educational attainment of that block where that student lives. And to give an example of how this would play out, we can look at two schools, Mount Washington Elementary, and I will disclose that my son is right here. He goes to Mount Washington Elementary School, and Highlandtown Elementary School, right? And on paper, these two schools look fairly identical in terms of the number of children living in poverty, and would therefore receive relatively equal amounts of funding. However, the tiers methodology is applied. The formula would see that many more of the children at Highlandtown Elementary School live in much deeper poverty, and as a result would get a lot more funding. And again, it's not likely to pass, but it's important to show up because it's possible that this passes in future years. And even if no more money is added to education, the methodology can be used to apply to the existing money that is already allocated to education, making it much more equitable. And lastly, I just want to mention that we expect to see bills that seek to reestablish more punitive approaches to school discipline and school safety. And we will actively work to kill any bill that we believe will support the school to prison pipeline. Thank you.
A lot of really good stuff from a lot of different folks. I'm excited to hear and listen and continue to learn. Our good family from CASA of Maryland is here, and we're going to welcome up to the podium our representative from CASA of Maryland to speak with us today. Please let us give a nice round of applause for Ms. Catherine Paul.
Good morning. How is everybody doing this morning? Good. I'm really excited to be here. I love LBS to death. They are doing life-changing work, and I'm so honored to be here. My name is Catherine Paul. I'm the Public Policy Director at CASA. Raise your hand if you're familiar with CASA. Oh, good. I love it. Well, for those who are not familiar, CASA is one of the largest immigrant advocacy organizations in the Mid-Atlantic region. And certainly in Maryland, we do a lot of really deep work, very specifically Baltimore City, Baltimore County, throughout Montgomery County, Prince George's as well. And we are a services and advocacy organization. So we provide a whole bunch of different services, from legal services to citizenship services, ESOL, taxes, the list goes on and on. But we also pair that with advocacy. And we believe we can only run services if we're doing that with a pathway out of services, right? And so we do services at every level of government. I'm super excited to talk about Maryland. So much going on in Maryland right now. So I want to talk, CASA is a multi-issue organization. We do, we work on a ton of different issues. I'm going to talk to you mainly about healthcare, but we also have pretty robust campaigns going on around housing, around climate equity, and around immigration, of course, broadly. Everything is an immigration issue, in my opinion. So first I want to start off by saying thank you, because a lot of folks here today, I know for a fact, supported our legislation last session to pass the Healthy Babies Equity Act. Are folks familiar with the Healthy Babies Equity Act? Okay, I see some nodding. So the Healthy Babies Equity Act was a bill that passed recently that opens up Medicaid to undocumented pregnant parents. So currently, if you are undocumented, you are not eligible because of your status to enroll in Medicaid. And what the Healthy Babies Equity Act did was it opened it up to undocumented women and allowed them to start receiving that care. Now, there are limitations to this, right? Because we believe that everybody should have access to healthcare, not only if you're undocumented and pregnant. So we have a lot more work to do, but I'm really excited to share with you that since that has passed, 4,000 pregnant mothers now have access to healthcare and have enrolled in Medicaid. So super exciting. But we have a lot more work to do. So there are kind of two pathways that we're focused on on the state level to make sure that everybody has access to healthcare regardless of your immigration status. And that is opening up Medicaid and opening up the Affordable Care Act. So the bill that will be introduced this upcoming session was introduced 3 times before, and with everyone's support here, I know we're gonna get it done this year. It's called the Access to Care Act. This bill specifically focuses on opening up the ACA, which is the state marketplace. So what it does, because the Affordable Care Act is a federal program, what the bill does is it requires the state to get federal permission to apply for a waiver from the federal government to get federal approval so that the state can make their own state decision to open up the program to folks regardless of their immigration status. We are also pushing for subsidies to make sure when people buy their insurance through the marketplace, they don't just have the ability to buy, but they're also getting the same subsidies that everybody else is buying to make healthcare affordable. So really excited for that bill to come forward. For those who followed it last year, it got through the House and we couldn't get it through the Senate. This year, we are going to get it through both chambers and hopefully get it passed and get that process started to open it up. One of the things that, one of the reasons why I love being at LBS is because a lot of people don't think about immigration as a Black issue, right? And it is. You know that. The conversation, the national conversation about immigration has been very focused on the border. It's been very focused around the brown Latino community, which is absolutely true. These folks are impacted in so many different ways, but our Black community is impacted in so many ways. A lot of people don't think or realize what a large undocumented Black population we have, right? And immigrant population broadly, whether it's from places like my own family, Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana. Any West Indians here today? Okay, in Baltimore, the biggest groups are of course Jamaican, Haitian. We have a growing Cameroonian population here in Maryland. What's happening at the federal level right now, for those who haven't been following, is very bad. So those who have followed a little bit know that immigrants right now are under attack, and Black immigrants in particular, we know are facing sort of a double jeopardy of impact, right? And so when we think about healthcare, we already are super familiar with how Black mothers in particular are disproportionately impacted when it comes to childcare, right? And so bills like the Healthy Babies Equity Act, there's a whole separate level of consequences, right, that Black immigrant mothers face, right, when they don't have access to that care. So other things I just briefly don't want to go deep into, but just want to put on your radar are a couple of housing pieces of legislation. So there are rent stabilization fights happening all over the state of Maryland. And hopefully soon in Baltimore City, we'll start seeing that on the local level. But CASA has been in the fight to stabilize rent. And so we just saw in Montgomery County, no rent increases over 3%, right? We've been seeing folks, community members come to our offices with their rent increased by like 47%, right? It's crazy. That's not a rent increase, that's an eviction because no one can pay that. And so we are working on continuing to build the support on the state level so we can pass local legislation to get those rent stabilization bills passed. Other things to flag for you, the Tenant Safety Act will be reintroduced. This is a really important bill. What it does is basically it allows tenants to sue their landlords jointly, right? So we have tenants who, all across the board, one whole hallway of people with mold issues who are all fighting individual fights, right, with their landlord. The Tenant Safety Act makes it easier for these tenants to hold their landlord accountable together. Just cause eviction, people being evicted for no reason. We want to make sure there's an actual reason, right? You can't just stop renewing your lease because you don't like the tenant or you don't want to deal with them, right? So just cause eviction, and I know you guys are going to hear from Chair Wilkins later today. She is the champion on that bill. And then finally, access to counsel. Before I get to access to counsel and immigration proceedings, I want to talk about access to counsel and eviction proceedings. So eviction court is one of those spaces in civil court where you do not have the right to a lawyer, right? So usually if you go into court, you don't have a lawyer, you get access to one, right? You get a public defender if you can't afford it. That is not the case when it comes to eviction court. And what the result is tons of different people are coming to court and they're fighting their case on their own without any expertise, without any housing background, and they're almost guaranteed to lose their case, right? Which sets them up to be evicted. So access to counsel funding passed in a previous session, and one of our priorities this year is making sure that money keeps coming in, so that people, when they have to, unfortunately, go to eviction court, that they have the resources that they need to defend themselves. Climate equity, we're always working on climate equity, sort of broadly, really making sure that there is a Black and brown lens on every single piece of climate legislation that moves forward this session. We want to make sure that as folks are making decisions about how we solve, right, climate change, that our people don't bear the brunt of that, right? And so if folks are interested in following the work that we're doing on climate equity, super excited to talk to folks about that. And then lastly, access to counsel and immigration proceedings. Just like eviction court, when you go to immigration court, you do not have a right to a lawyer. So hundreds and thousands of people are going to court and they are forced to understand our legal system, to defend themselves, and not even speak the language in most cases, right? It is critical that people have access to legal support. It doesn't change the system as a whole, but it gives them a lot better chance at fighting their case, staying with their families, keeping families together. So we will be fighting this session to make sure that legislation, funding stays intact, so that way we can continue to make sure that people who are in ICE detention right now have the legal support that they need. And that's all I have for you. I'm really grateful. Thank you guys so much.
If you look on your, Kathy, you are a little not as critically gifted as others. If you look on your agenda, we have a piece here for the Baltimore Regional Water Governance Task Force. I'm going to be presenting on that, but admittedly, I'll be more brief than our other panelists because I do want to get to a Q&A. When we reach our point for break, if there are questions, concerns, or issues that you have, I'll be happy to converse with you personally about that, just because I do want to give space for the other panelists. Before we do that, shout out to our folks that are streaming with us. We are appreciative that those that are here with us, but shout out to all of y'all watching on Facebook, on YouTube, on Twitter Live, everywhere else. There's a TikTok, I suppose. There's like me, I don't know what spaces they use these days, but we appreciate you caring enough about Black folks in this upcoming legislation to plug in with us, so thank you. A quick note about the Baltimore Regional Governance Water Task Force. For those who are here in the room, raise your hand if you're familiar or have heard that this is a thing that exists. Okay, so we're going to do a little overview. In the last legislative session, as brought forth and supported by the mayor of Baltimore City, there was a task force that was commissioned to study almost a regional authority for managing the water system. Baltimore's water system is currently owned and operated by Baltimore City, while still providing water for some surrounding counties, particularly Baltimore County and portions of Howard and Anne Arundel County. This water task force has taken on the recommendation of a consultant that put together about a 300-page document. One element of that document argued or suggested that perhaps a regional authority model would be a more efficient way to manage the water system. That would come with a host of challenges that the task force has not yet answered, suggested, or remedied. The three most important or impactful areas I would point to would be: one, economic. Ratepayers in Baltimore City and Baltimore County, quite honestly, who could not afford any potential rate increases would face water shutoffs. As is legally mandated now, we do not have water shutoffs for Baltimore City water. Second, there's a racial impact. The racial impact is Baltimore City is overwhelmingly an African-American city. I love when I say African-American. That's my putting my TV voice on, African-American, right? That's what Black people don't, that's when you don't know actual Black people. You say African-Americans. Baltimore City is a Black city. It is a majority Black city, and most of our workforce is predominantly Black. But this would have dire and consequential effects on namely the Black residents. Am I theorizing this? No. We have evidence in places like Detroit, in places like Birmingham, also predominantly Black cities, that moved to a regional water authority model. We've seen that Black ratepayers particularly were disproportionately affected. Paraphrasing Reverend Joseph Lowry, may he rest in peace, when America stubs its toe, Black America breaks its foot, right? And so we're worried about the potential impacts that would happen if the racial analysis had not been done. And as is, the task force that is slated to make their recommendations before the upcoming legislative session has not conducted a racial equity study. They've said that we actually don't have the time, or we might not have the money, but we've done an environmental impact study. Baltimore City itself, despite Baltimore City, Baltimore County, and Howard County having representatives here, Baltimore City funded the consultant study and the environmental impact study. Baltimore City alone. Remember that, please, Baltimoreans, when your local officials and elected officials tell you we don't have money. And finally, the concern that we have, and I bring this admittedly from my own personal perspective as a union worker, is what will happen to those union members. There are two specific unions, three quite honestly, that will be affected. AFSCME, the City Union of Baltimore, and Baltimore County Federation of Public Employees. Those folks work for the Departments of Public Works in the various county and city municipalities that will be affected. There are no answers as to what would happen with their pensions. There are no answers as to what would happen with their jobs or wages. There are no answers as to whether or not those places would have union protection still. The most recent task force meeting that happened, there was expected to be a vote to recommend a regional authority. Thankfully, that vote had been postponed because there were far too many questions left up in the air about, one, the racial impact because there had not been a racial equity status. Two, the labor impact because there had not been any studies to be done on what would happen with those workers. And three, how would this work? How would this negotiate or jive with, quite honestly, the 2018 Charter E amendment that Baltimoreans voted on when they voted for no privatization or leasing of independent leasing of the Baltimore water. It must remain a public franchise. In order to do this, the state would functionally be overturning the will of Baltimore voters. That sounds very undemocratic. And if there's anything the people in the United States love to tell us we have, it's democracy. And so because those three things are unresolved, thankfully, there were those on the task force who were willing to stand up and say, I can't vote for this recommendation right now. And as we know with any good voting system, when the whip finds out they don't have enough votes, they just don't have the election, right? Rather than lose and have it publicly demonstrated that they did not get what they wanted because the people pushed back. And so we have been in conversation with Delegate Stephanie Smith, who is the chair of the Baltimore City delegation. We have been and aspire to be in conversation with Senator Joe Carter, who, as we know, is the people's champion, but introduced this legislation and admittedly did so on behalf of Baltimore City as a courtesy. We've been in conversation with those folks because if and when this reappears in the state legislature, we want to ensure that the legislators from Baltimore City will have the back of Baltimoreans. We offer as an alternative, and I continue to use we because there's a coalition of racial justice, labor justice, and environmental justice advocacy groups who are working along this. You all in this room, y'all all worked on some campaign. You know, don't nobody push no boulder up the hill by themselves, right? It's all of us get behind and push that thing a little bit. And so we who are working on this are advocating for those elected officials from Baltimore City to ensure and in fact engage in perhaps an alternative model. The alternative model would be a stronger intergovernmental relationship agreement that has been modeled in places like Charlotte, in conjunction with Charlotte and Mecklenburg County, where the city of Charlotte has more votes on an advisory committee that then makes recommendations to the city of Charlotte that determines how the water would be adjudicated and allocated. Places like Tampa, Birmingham, and Detroit are models for what a regional authority can do. Baltimoreans pay far more into our water system than our residents in the county. And look, if you live in the county, we ain't trying to pick on you. We love you too. Just pay your fair share. That's all. Right? And so we want to first enforce the already agreement that we have. Some reports allege that Baltimore County has underpaid for their water by as much as $22 million. As the county continues to boom and speaks of all its luscious resources while they look down on the city and tell their residents not to visit, right? So these are the concerns that we have. for the workers, for the environmental justice, for the will of Baltimoreans, for Baltimore City's greatest financial asset in the spirit of turning it over, and finally for those Baltimore County resident and ratepayers who they themselves may not have the resources to afford the rate hikes that will come. How do you compensate Baltimore City for its resources, $5 billion? How do you compensate Baltimore City or pay for the debt transfer? How do you manage these things? Particularly when you tell us you don't have the time or money for a racial equities investigation. So that is something that I am grateful that our colleagues and friends here at the Leaders of the Beautiful Struggle have agreed to kind of work with us in solidarity, right? Because all of these are efforts of solidarity. You see here at our table, a collection of groups. Why? Because everything is done in community. Everything is done with solidarity. So that was my brief piece on the Baltimore Regional Water Governance Task Force. And now we're going to open it up for a Q&A. The way that we're going to do this is simply raise your hand. I used to be a school teacher once, so I know how to pick on people and have folks. I'm going to get us started with a question. Following that first question, then we'll open it up to our audience. If you can, if you have the capacity to, please be as specific or precise to whom you would like to address your question to our panelists. If there is something that does fall into your purview as well as a colleague's, feel free to answer. But in the spirit of time, if it's something that is specific to one organization or one particular cause, we feel satisfied if that person would answer that question. Does that work for our panelists? Does that work for our audience? Anybody got any disagreements? All right, we have a sense of our organization right here. Go ahead and speak your piece if you don't. I'm going to start. Brother Lawrence, you kicked us off this morning with the reparations presentation. And there may be questions. You brought it down to us locally, and we appreciate that. How do we strategize, or what's the infrastructure in place to determine who's going to be on the reparations committees or commissions in the various locales?
You want me to use the microphone?
I know you do.
We're going to use our outside voice. Matter of fact, I don't know what's my point. We're going to use our outside voice. Go right ahead.
So in Baltimore City, we passed the bill a few months ago. So that bill is modeled actually after the bill that was passed around the police accountability boards, the PABs. That was concerned with the PABs that when you have all the power to appoint to a board that has really important things to do, like police accountability or allocating funds, putting that much power in the hands of the executive, in this case, the mayor of Baltimore City, would allow them just to pick people they knew, people from their networks, people from their donor networks, people from their friends. And so the question is, what is a more democratic alternative to that, while recognizing you need to actually have some type of so-called gatekeeper? So our decision was modeled after the PAB legislation. City council people appoint someone to the Reparations Commission. The mayor, in terms of the state charter, the mayor has to be like the formal person who appoints someone to one of these commissions. But the idea was that they can either accept the nomination, or if they reject it, they have to give a written reason why. So that's basically holding to the city's charter, which says the mayor does have the authority to appoint people to these boards, but creating a role for city council people so that they're able to hold people up to the mayor and basically put them in a tough political position where they have to reject somebody. So the idea is that it's easier to put leverage on a city council or county council person than is a mayor, a governor, or a state senator. Because those have been the people who have been in charge of appointing people to the equivalent of these commissions in other states. So the Illinois model is held up as an example of statewide so-called reparations for war on drugs. They don't use the word reparations. But their model is basically entirely the governor, leader of Senate, leader of the House, and 4 returning citizens. And that money being centralized in Illinois, in the state capital of Illinois, and not places like Chicago, the South Side, led people to say that money is very hard to get. We actually talked to people from Illinois. I just talked to somebody last week from Illinois. And they were like, yeah, they got a lot of money, but it's very difficult for regular grassroots people to get it. So we were adamant about improving upon the models that came from other places by centering on local control, right? So in Baltimore City, we have the commission. Prince George's County has a similar commission modeled after our local bill, but every other locality in the state is going to have to pass a similar piece of legislation. Because the idea is you can't really mandate local control, community accountability. All you can really do is create legal policy mechanisms that create the most opportunity for the will of the people to manifest itself. So we as people have to be organized to advocate for the people we want to see on the commission and be on the commission. Now, we've heard the commission has not been formally announced or appointed yet. We've heard some potential nominations just generally in Baltimore City, but nothing is official yet. But yet, the idea is that people can bring to that city council people who they want on the commission, and if they don't like that person, you can make an issue in the next election. And we know city council people are elected with a few thousand votes. So actually having an issue of who is in charge of that money is a meaningful thing for a city council person that may not be as meaningful for a state senator or a governor or a mayor. So that's the theory behind that.
So the brother right here had a question.
Yes, please. I direct this to anybody on this panel that feels they have the answer. Are there any efforts afoot now to mobilize the masses of returning citizens, formerly incarcerated people, to one, register to vote, and two, to become more politically active?
I think I can take that. So there is an effort to, right now there's actually a bill that's being introduced by Delegate Janelle Wilkins that will expand the ballot to folks who are currently incarcerated with felony convictions. A couple of years ago, there was a bill that was passed to extend the ballot to folks who are eligible to vote while incarcerated. So currently, if you're incarcerated with a misdemeanor or you're on pretrial, you haven't lost your right to vote, but most people don't know that. And so the goal of that bill is to ensure that the State Board of Elections is getting the ballot to those people who are registered and eligible. So there are coalitions across the state that are working on these issues and are trying to do just that, but we still have some work ahead of us.
And the post-incarcerated population?
So a lot of people don't know, are not informed that they have their rights restored. That law change happened in 2016, and the state has done little to nothing to actually make sure that people who have returned home are aware of that. The bill that passed in 2022 required the inside the correctional facilities and inside of the the parole and probation offices that they have signage up there inform people their rights have been restored. But we're still in the implementation phase of that, and so there's still a lot of work to do to really inform people of their rights, and that's something that's going to be going on as we're trying to pass this second bill.
I see some hands in the audience. We have one off of line though. I do want to make sure we shout out our folks who are watching us via stream, because I want to encourage them to ask their questions in the comments, whether it be YouTube, Facebook, wherever you're watching. We have one question for whomever thinks they're best served to speak to housing and domestic violence survivors. What can our state elected officials do to create more housing for survivors of domestic violence? We hear that boards are having a hard time helping folks get to safety because housing is scarce. Anyone who works in housing can help us with that.
You know, I think there are some efforts around this happening led by Public Justice Center. So I would, for whoever it is, I would be happy to connect you with those contacts. I do know too that there is a housing coalition, the Renters United Maryland Coalition, that has been working around some of the issues that I spoke about, around rent stabilization, around evictions, protecting folks as they go through eviction proceedings and so on. And that coalition has been really, I think, opening the conversation more broadly to how family and domestic issues, how folks can be protected in family and domestic issues. So also happy to connect you with anyone who's super interested in getting locked in with Renters United Maryland.
Thank you. I have a question for CASA. I am aware of recent, as you were saying, there's sort of this attack against immigrants just broadly across the country and the federal level in states, and a lot of rhetoric around like the threat of immigrants, especially recent immigrants, to the benefit systems of states, right? And these transfer benefits from one population to another. And so my question for you is based on what I've sort of been seeing in that space, which is the tension between trying to ensure equitable benefits for Black and brown people who are not immigrants, and then the tension between making sure that immigrant populations that are also Black and brown are recipients of benefits that should be available to them. And one example I can say is some states looking at providing in-state tuition for immigrant populations, or even DACA, where the Black and brown population is sort of being set up by those who have interest in causing tension to say, well, I am in the same income bracket or lower income bracket, but I'm a US citizen, but I just moved from Florida to North Carolina and I have to pay out of state tuition. It's $15,000 versus this law for recent immigrants or new immigrants that they only pay $5,000 because it's in state? Like, how is that equitable? Are you addressing that? Do you see that? And if so, how do you all sort of bridge that conversation?
Oh my gosh, that's such a good question. I mean, on public benefits, I've worked on so many immigration campaigns to shut down ICE detention. I mean, keep police officers from asking about immigration status. Really intense campaigns. But the worst, and I think the most controversial, which a lot of people don't realize, are the public benefit campaigns. Like, one of the hardest ones was opening up tax credits to undocumented taxpayers, right? And now healthcare, right? Yeah, in terms of in-state tuition, but I think a lot of folks are familiar with the DREAM Act, right? That passed, oh my goodness, what year was it now? I guess it went into effect in 2012. But the DREAM Act has been amazing. It's been transformative. There's still a lot more work to do because, and for those who haven't followed what it does, it allows undocumented folks to pay in-state tuition, right, in the state of Maryland. You know, I think there's a big conversation that happens in every debate around, like, if we expand this benefit, isn't it gonna force a bunch of people or like invite a bunch of people to the state of Maryland? As if this is a bad thing. And I think the response is, that's a good thing. We want immigrants to come to Maryland. We love immigrants. They contribute so deeply to our everything, right? To our workforce, to our economy, to the fabric of really and truly every single thing that we do, right? And I think in terms of other states that are working on similar campaigns or working on campaigns to do the opposite, CASA has been deeply involved. We're in multiple different national networks that are working to support states who have real viability of moving something forward, right? So I think, like, we've seen in-state tuition move in Virginia, where there's a campaign that's going on in Pennsylvania, there's a campaign that's going on in Georgia, right? And then we see a whole bunch of like anti-immigrant campaigns happening in Florida, in all the places you would expect, right? I think that we broadly want to change the narrative around, like, you know, increasing these benefits is going to be bad for our state. Increasing these benefits is going to be good for our state. It's going to bring goodness into our state, right? And we want to support every state that's ready to do that, right? Because I think, as you spoke to, on the federal level, right now, right, at least until the next election, it is not possible to get immigration reform passed through Congress. We do not have votes, period, on immigration. And because of that, a lot of our efforts have been focused not on what we can get through Congress, but what we can get done administratively, right? And there is a lot that can be done administratively. And so people might have seen the president announced recently that DACA recipients will now be eligible, what we're fighting for on the state level, will now be able to apply for the ACA. That's a really important federal focus that we were able to get done as DACA remains in limbo, right? But other types of relief, like TPS, right, temporary protected status, DED, protected DACA broadly, there's still a lot that we could do administratively. So I think focusing in on supporting other states paired with administrative advocacy at the federal level, right, until we go into a next Congress, that's a little bit of the strategy that we're focused on right now. Did that answer your question?
Hi, my name is Veronica Wright, and I'm the founder of the National Coalition for Drug Legalization. We support the legalization of all drugs. My question is probably more for ACLU, but any of you guys can chime in. What work have you guys done to protect people's civil liberties to use drugs and to address drug market violence here in the state of Maryland and in particular Baltimore? And if there hasn't been a large push to address those two issues? What can we do together to get that work started?
So our work has primarily been focused on the eliminating the issues related to marijuana. So we just recently passed the odor bill, which was a huge win this past session. And that would prohibit police from stopping and searching people solely based on the alleged odor of marijuana, and includes an exclusionary rule in there that says that if the police conduct a search in violation of the law, that anything obtained cannot be used against the individual in court. And then we're working on the eliminating criminal penalties bill, but we have not moved on to larger, working on all other drugs. Other legislators have introduced legislation related to that, and there have been other advocacy groups that have been focused on that. But we've been primarily focused on marijuana legalization and those issues because that's where we've seen the most criminalization of Black and brown people here in Maryland. Not to say that there aren't other drug offenses that are also disproportionately impacting Black and brown people, but this is the one that we've been hearing the most from our intake line when people reach out to us for legal assistance, what we're hearing from our community members, what we're hearing directly from people who've been impacted by police violence. So that's where our primary focus has been, and there's a lot more work left to do to fix those issues. And then afterwards, I think we'll reevaluate, at least internally at our organization, and figure out what's next. But right now we're committed to our strategic plan, which includes working on these issues.
Question for Frank from ACLU about education. He talked a little bit about the blueprint increasing so much money, but the lack of any curriculum change. Is there space to go and revisit the legislation itself, the Kirby Commission's blueprint, to open it up to get some mandates around pedagogy, around curriculum, or is that new legislation that we have to move forward?
Well, there's some language already in the blueprint bill that directs the work of looking at curriculum, but it's not very specific, and it doesn't specifically say anything about how the curriculum has to be multicultural and reflect the populations that live here. I don't think it would be feasible to try to go back into the blueprint bill and try to amend that bill with new legislation. I think it's completely new legislation and a large movement of people demanding this. That's gonna move the needle.
We heard from, and this question is from out from Justice, we heard that Governor Moore and President Biden's team really happy about the trades and building infrastructure in order to, Baltimore is a building hub. That's some language that we've gotten. Have there been any targeted efforts for our returning citizens to be included in some of the trade practices, the apprenticeships and labor efforts that President Biden, Governor Moore, and their teams are touting? Have any that you have been made aware of? And if not, how can we support those efforts to help our returning citizens?
So that is an excellent question. And I will just say, in the conversations in the rooms that I have been in regarding the IIJA, the Infrastructure Act, it is very, I'll say it's very white collar. Like, it's very much C-suite individuals, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies coming in and basically having these discussions, but not very many individuals who are representative of the individuals on the ground are present in those spaces, in those areas. So I think part of what JOTF's job is to do is that when we find ourselves like in those spaces, specifically advocate for those individuals and basically like point out like, hey, there are too many people making 7 figures at these tables and at these conversations. There aren't enough people who are actually familiar with the realities of these economic hardships, and we need to make sure that those individuals are at the table and part of the conversation. Because, I mean, just the status quo is that these individuals won't be invited unless like there's actual fervor and actual argument for them to be made and make sure that they're in these spaces. So I think that's is what JOTF and any of these organizations at the table with me should definitely be promoting when we are in those spaces.
It's my apologies too. That was from Job Opportunities Task Force, not Out for Justice. That was on me. My apologies. We have a question right here.
Yeah, I'm in northern North Carolina, and I'm up here for some business, and I would come to this to hear. Is there anything being done in Maryland and some of the other states that are not really in play in electoral college voting to help get out the vote in these important swing states? And what is what is the problem with people wanting to vote in this election? They're saying they're staying home again. They're not excited about what the Biden and Moore administrations are doing. Can anyone address that?
I can go first.
Go first, Lauren.
So we don't do anything cross statewide in terms of get out the vote. But one thing that I did in 2020 is do elections breakdown. And as the director of research, I went through the data in Pennsylvania on Philadelphia turnout. And while there was all this talk about, Black people saved Biden, Black people showed up, increased turnout was actually down in 2020 in Philadelphia compared to 2016. So I think that's an example of a shift in the Democratic Party that kind of reflects some of the things I was saying around Biden has flipped a certain core of largely people who work at nonprofits, educated, culturally liberal, but may have been voting Republican in the past, but now a lot of them are voting Democrat. And therefore giving money to nonprofits is seen as a political victory. But the actual community control, the actual cultural competency, the actual sovereignty that would actually bring out urban voters is actually being traded off. So the Democratic Party is choosing to trade off a certain professional, college-educated voter with a more poor, working class voter that's been the core of the Democratic Party for a long time. And I think the feeling is, well, they're inconsistent voters. They want things that are very difficult to give, right? Part of what we're trying to do with our reparations policy is say what we're doing here in Maryland is a model. In the two states we look to, Pennsylvania and North Carolina, that have not yet legalized cannabis, that are swing states, that have large populations of poor working class Black people that feel like y'all keep talking about raising revenue, but nothing ever changes where we are. So our feeling is that if we have these locally controlled reparations political containers, and they actually are a resource, people will feel that in a way they don't feel, dumping money into these nonprofit infrastructures that many people don't like the quality of services they're given. And that actually could be a tool to increase turnout in elections. But that will require being willing to give political control to working class Black and brown people. And I think that there's just been a real anxiety around that in the Democratic Party.
And when you say they've made that trade-off, is that because they're not getting out information to those communities that are staying home? Are they staying home or are they voting Republican?
Well, I'm going to just use my personal experience, my research to give a simple answer. Think of Joe Biden being the architect of the crime bill. If I'm a poor working class Black person whose family was equally impacted by that crime bill, I'm looking at Joe Biden and saying, you're asking me to vote for the guy who locked up my family.
Yeah.
And they may even consider it. But it's like, you got to give me something besides he's not Trump, right? An actual material institution that they feel like they actually control.
Right.
And part of the problem is they've been willing to resource, I can't vote out the head of a large foundation. I can't vote out the head of most large nonprofits because they're accountable to their donors largely. But I can vote out the head of my city. So there's been a big push to put money into these nonprofit institutions. Many scholars say because of the anxiety around cities in America becoming led by Black leaders in the 70s and 80s. So there's a push away from large, robust public institutions controlled by local governance and funding those institutions federally towards federal and state governments funding nonprofit institutions, which may be diverse in their staff, but actually are controlled by people who are not accountable to community. So there has to be a shift towards giving power and resource to locally controlled institutions where working class Black and brown people can use their vote to actually move those resources in the way they actually want to see moved.
Well, Lawrence, that doesn't sound much like democracy. No, the thing we're told about the United States is that this is such a democratic place. Please, for those who may not be aware, that's clearly sarcasm. When asking about Mr. Biden, I think about our Lacey Clay Sr. No permanent friends, no permanent enemies, just permanent interests. We have another question about housing that comes from one of our viewers online, and so whomever feels comfortable answering that, I welcome you to do so. Elder homeowners, mainly Black women in Baltimore City, aren't aware of the services they have that can maintain their homes, and many are being preyed on by predatory buyers preying on their vulnerability. What is the state doing to support advocacy groups that help these legacy owners, and how can we as the public support those efforts?
I mean, I'll just lift up Renters United Maryland again. Most of the focus right now, the advocacy right now, has been focused on current tenants who are dealing with their current landlords, right, or going through eviction processes, right? Not necessarily like predatory, lenders and things like that. But there's a big avenue and big space for advocacy around that. I think for people who are interested in doing work around that. And I think, is it Marceline who's doing a ton of consumer work. So I can connect you with the folks who are doing some advocacy around that, absolutely.
We appreciate that. Let's give a round of applause to our panelists. We're going to take a break, as you see on your agenda. Look at us being on time. One time for us, right? We're going to take a break. We're going to reconvene at 1 o'clock, and we're going to have more of our politics around youth violence panel, and then we'll wrap up. So please feel free to converse with these folks, converse with each other. We are all in this together, building community.
So we know. Okay. So you are. So yeah. That's crazy. I'm next to you. I'm not gonna tell So tell me, you're the president. Yeah, I got I just yeah. Oh, So, yeah, I give you my budget. I give you my business set, which is that you can email me at some point. Yeah, I got an hour and a half. I'm Craig Waddy, well, I actually we're in the water states for the most part of the I usually the government down in DC, right? A few other things. I've only water. Well, yeah, we're looking at equity in the water space. Yeah. So, yeah, not like the yes, definitely. But I actually yes. I know. Okay. What's up, Mark? Yeah. That's great. Well, get started. You know what? The one thing I didn't get from you. I no, I'm good. I'm really just trying to get that. I think I've heard you probably remember something. 2019. I was at Howard and I literally just remember.
All right, good afternoon. Can I have folks begin to return to their seats? Would folks be kind enough to begin to return to their seats for us, please? Thank you kindly. One of my favorite things to do as the person who stands at the front of the room in front of the microphone is give the big flowery introductions. And I know often it feels like those things are just performance-based, but we have some folks with us who are real powerful and dynamic, and we want to give them the reverence, the respect, and quite honestly, the community appreciation that they deserve. The reason we echo the community appreciation is because they will go other places in their halls of power, wherever they work, and they will not be greeted this way. And that gets challenging, right? Raise your hand if you've ever done some advocacy work and got knocked down once or twice. Raise your hand. Yeah, so you know that gets difficult. And so you do need a place where you get to come home and everybody say, we proud of you, man. You're doing a good job. We saw you over there fighting for us. Thank you, right? Thank you. And we are grateful to have folks like that here with us today. And first and foremost, we're going to introduce LBS's own, our good brother, Davon Love. Let's give him a round of applause. And then we're going to introduce the People's Chair, the state senator from the 41st district. Everybody calls their district the Fighting. Nah, I live in it, so I'm getting to claim it. The Fighting 41st, our own Senator Joe Carter. Davon and Senator Carter will later be joined by Delegate Stephanie Smith, the chair of the Baltimore City delegation. So in her absence, and when she goes back and watches this on YouTube or wherever, she's going to know we showed her some love too. So let's give her a round of applause for her absence. She'll be with us momentarily, and I'm going to turn the microphone over to Davon to begin this conversation on the politics about youth violence. Thank you.
All right, greetings, family. Good afternoon. As was mentioned, I am Davon Love, Director of Public Policy of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. And so we're going to have a conversation, two people that, I admire, care about, respect very dearly. With Senator Carter, someone who I've known for a long time, and someone who's really contributed to our own, political worldview, perspective, and work. So it's always, good to be in conversation with you. Before we get started, on the agenda, the conversation here that you see is around the issues around youth and violence and juvenile, the attempted rollbacks of juvenile justice. But we're going to have a conversation that's a little broader than that. What I want to do is I'm going to provide just some framework for the way that LBS approaches these issues politically. Lawrence actually alluded to this a little bit on the previous panel. We're clear that Black people in this two-party system are a captured electorate. So when you think about the fact that Black people comprise the majority of our political wherewithal exists within the Democratic Party, and there's certainly limitations that the Democratic Party has in terms of its delivery on policy for Black people, that to the extent that Black people are going to benefit from it, is to the extent that we're able to pressure the party to provide concessions that it otherwise would not give, right? And so that's an important frame, because when we think about people's engagement with the larger political process, there's often a belief that if a party says it represents a certain constituency, but yet we don't see the impact of that patronage, right, or the support of that party, then there's often conversation around, well, what good is engaging in politics if these parties don't deliver? And what we say is that it's our responsibility, as people of African descent, to organize ourselves in order to make these institutions do what needs to be done in order to positively impact our community. So that's a really important frame, because both on the conversation around juvenile justice and just broader conversations around some of the other political things that we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about it from that frame as that having to push the Democratic Party leadership, state leadership. We're going to have to push them in order to get the concessions we need. We can't rely on their goodwill. We can't rely on their pronouncements. And so part of the importance of this conversation is to think about how to properly organize ourselves to be able to have impactful legislative advocacy. So I'll stop there. Delegate Smith says she's close. So what I'll do first, Senator Carter, is if you could introduce, just yourself, your work over the past several years in the legislature. This will be your 20th year since you've gone into legislative office. So if you can talk to us a little bit about just some of the things that you've worked on over the years, and then you can blend that into some of the things that you want to do this coming session.
Thank you. Thanks, Davon. Let me first start by saying thank you for your 13 years of advocacy. You really brought a much needed advocacy and narrative and pressure to the legislature that did not exist. So y'all, LBS has really done a great job. Also, thanks to everybody that is here. And please, if you're a part of a community or an organization, please share with that organization and or community what the legislative agenda is, because we need all hands on deck. So as Davon said, it's been 20 years, and I look at it as 20 years of survival of the political machine and the political environment in Maryland. And 20 years ago, I think it's about 20 years ago, most deaf said the millennium is almost here and a lot of things have changed, but a lot of things have not, mainly us. And I would posit that that still remains pretty true today, despite the incremental progress that we make. So with that being said, I'm not really sure what else to say. I don't know if you want me to talk about the session and bills that are coming up, or.
Well, talk about some of the things that you worked on, particularly some of the criminal justice stuff.
So, in the beginning, all right, so this is gonna be a long conversation. In the beginning, there was me, the only Black woman attorney in the Maryland House of Delegates 20 years ago, my first election. And I sponsored legislation to expand expungement of non-convictions. And here we are 20 years later, still pushing that envelope. We made progress. We passed a law that said that just because you have a prior conviction for something and then you get a subsequent charge, you are no longer prohibited from expungement of that charge. But we still have not passed something called the unit rule fully, which says that if you're charged with a multitude of things, which you know, if you ever seen a charging document, you've seen somebody might have 20 charges for like one offense that they ultimately are found guilty on. It could be all the way up to murder to the lowest level, could be trespass they're found guilty on, but they could never expunge the murder, the robbery, the rape, even if they didn't do it, the gun. None of that is expungible because they had one little conviction out of all of the massive charges. That's something that we still have to work on, and the Maryland judiciary has been pretty largely a roadblock to that. But I think that because the entire state is now up on MDEC, the electronic filing, it should not any longer be a real obstacle to getting that done. There's police reform, there's Christopher's Law, which was 2012, around the same time the country was mourning and becoming outraged over Trayvon Martin. And at that time, if you remember, that every 28 hours a Black man, woman, or child was killed at the hands of law enforcement. So Christopher Brown in Baltimore County was strangled to death by a Baltimore County police officer. And that was probably my first effort at real police reform in terms of making sure that there was accountability and modifying the law enforcement officer Bill of Rights and expanding diversity training and the like. And then, as you see, because we didn't pass strong enough laws in 2021, at the time of George Floyd, when the country was finally seeing how awful the police activities were in terms of killing with impunity many Black people, not only Black people, but primarily. Finally, the legislature woke up and decided to address the issue. But we're still here, and I think we're going to talk about it today. We're still here trying to pass legitimate, real, civilian-led accountability with the police accountability boards being able to do their own independent investigations and come up with their own findings outside of the internal affairs process. And, basically, there's still the concept of police policing themselves. We need a completely independent entity to review the actions of alleged misconduct of law enforcement. So that's one of the things on the table for this session. And just a myriad of other things. Shall I go into other bills?
Yes.
So this session, my priorities I would characterize as those for creating opportunities where we should have probably done it a long time ago. One of them is the jury service bill. In Maryland, a person is ineligible to even be summoned to jury service if they have a conviction for anything where the sentence was more than 1 year, okay? And that's including many misdemeanors, because the majority of misdemeanors have sentences that are longer than 1 year. Many other states, the majority of other states, have already passed a law that allows people that have a criminal conviction to be eligible for jury service. And let me tell you why it's super important. Aside from the fact that all over the state, people are getting repeatedly summoned for jury service because there's too small a pool, because this large pool is excluded. It's also critically important because constitutionally, a defendant is entitled to have a jury that represents a cross-section of the community, and that includes, for many people, people that have been convicted of something. And of course, there's a process in any jury selection called voir dire, where a person can be weeded out if there's any bias that's perceived. And so there's no legitimate reason to prohibit people with prior criminal convictions that have paid their debt to society from serving on a jury. And then, of course, not all cases are criminal, but we do, as I'm sure you've heard many times, we do incarcerate a higher percentage of Black people in any state in the country. Thus, we need to have a cross-section of the community serving on our juries. And then, even if anyone believed that because someone's had an encounter or a conviction in the criminal justice system, they're not eligible to serve on a jury, basically, there's the fact that there's civil juries as well. And there's no reason that someone couldn't sit on a medical malpractice jury or a car accident case or something like that. So that's something that Maryland really needs to get itself together on. Maryland needs to retain judicial elections. There's been an effort afoot for many years to get rid of judicial elections. And what does that mean? If you aren't part of the elite circle that is working on the partnership track at Piper and Marbury or Venerable Beecher and Howard, and you have a lot of people that are close political insiders advocating for you, you're just out there pounding the pavement and representing people in court and working hard. You don't have time to go to all of the bar association meetings. You often are excluded from consideration for the appointment process for judges. And we need judges that represent our communities. And we need judges that people should have a right to choose the judges that are going to preside over their most important issues. And so we have to retain judicial elections at all costs. Finally, I'm getting to, I think, the bill. So I'm sponsoring the LBS brainchild, the income tax reparations bill. You probably heard something about that. And then there's another bill that I think is critically important, because if we talk about education, we talk about transportation, we talk about all the things that our leadership sometimes says, oh, there's no money. Where's the money coming from? Well, for a very long time, we have a tax break system, tips and pilots, tax increment financing, and payment in lieu of taxes that is offered quite frequently to large developers. Yet there's very little to no monitoring of those processes to ensure that they are actually hiring local, they are actually creating community benefits and the like. And so I have a bill that would only study that process, because that's where the money is in large part. That's when people say, where are we getting the money? How about that? How about we tax some of the developers, or at least a little bit, like not complete tax breaks. And welcome, Delegate Stephanie Smith, the chair of the House delegation, as I'm the chair of the Senate. So I'll wrap up really quickly. I've got expungement legislation. We do a kind of a cookie cutter approach to who's eligible for expungement based on the charges, but it's my belief that we should look at the individual. The court should look at the individual and the individual's eligibility for expungement based on how they are conducting their lives, not just what the charges were. So we need a good cause expungement law where a judge can use discretion, not based on what we've said a person is entitled to. And then also, we have a second look bill that would kind of expand what we passed some years ago, where we passed a law that said if a person has served 20 years or more, but they're 18 or under the age of 18, they can have an opportunity to file for a modification of that sentence, to have another look at their sentence. Is it still serving public safety? Is it still serving the public? Is it serving them? And so my bill would expand that to all people. If it's been 20 years and you're still serving your sentence, that you would have an opportunity to have another review of that sentence. I think that's a very important thing as we talk about moving out of the mass incarceration of Black people in Maryland. And then finally, the opportunity to build a professional licensing. I've met a lot of people that have been incarcerated, but they are precluded from having professional licenses. So they work under the table. They may know HVAC, but they can't get an HVAC license. They may know nursing, but they can't get a nursing certificate because of their prior conviction. We need to eliminate that final investigative discrimination of people with criminal records. I'm sure there's more, but I am going to stop and turn it over to Delegate Smith.
I apologize for my tardiness. I'm Delegate Stephanie Smith. I represent the 45th District, which is East Baltimore, Northeast Baltimore. And as she noted, we both chair the House and Senate delegations in Annapolis. So I want to just go over a few things that I think are really big ticket items for us to focus on, and some of them are going to be, my pieces of legislation. The budget overall. So the budget for the state of Maryland is $63 billion, give or take. And as you've probably heard in the news already, the proposed budget to fund transportation is proposing $3.3 billion in cuts that disproportionately hurt the Baltimore region. And because of the makeup of the Baltimore region, will disproportionately impact Black Marylanders in this region. And so what does this mean? There are some projects that are being programmed for capital development across the state, but there hasn't been essentially a shovel in the ground, right? So cutting some of those projects, it's more of a theoretical impact. But when you're cutting core bus service, that's an immediate impact to people about getting where they need to go. When you're, cutting, they're proposing to cut the state of good repair funds by 30%, and we already know that there's a lot of maintenance issues with our light rail and other things that were even in the news this week. So when you already have a backlog of repairs, and then you're going to slash the fund that maybe will address that matter by 30%, that would also disproportionately fall upon Black Marylanders, particularly in this part of the state. And also something to mention is that we are the only county equivalent in the state that uses public transportation to move our children around to school. So with the light rail, being shut down indefinitely, and those core cuts to bus service, that will hamper the ability for young people to get to and from school in a way that would not be the same in another part of the state. And so again, who goes to Baltimore City Public Schools? Disproportionately Black children. And so this is again a proposal, it's not final. As you can imagine, there are a lot of conversations happening in the background, and some may have to come to the foreground, but quite frankly, this goes beyond the metaphor of leaving someone behind to literally leaving them behind. If they cannot go anywhere, if they cannot access, public transportation, they cannot take care of business and do the things that they need to do for their household. So one of the reasons why you're going to probably be hearing about some other cuts with other proposals in state government over the next several weeks is that by fiscal year 28, if we maintain status quo and do not, either get new revenues or make any cuts, we're looking at a $2.2 billion structural deficit by 2028. And that would mean by fiscal year 25, I think approximately 500 million. The reason why fiscal year 28 would have such a significant increase in our structural deficit is because under the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, which is the incredible investment that we're making in our public schools across the state, that obligation would come due if we did nothing right now to kind of prepare for that. And so I just want to list all of the budget concerns that I think are particularly of interest. How many of you keep hearing about how Maryland has the lowest unemployment rate in the nation? Have you been hearing that on the news? Fund to subsidize childcare, and not only did it get created, people found out about it and tapped into it. They didn't really have to market it. If it's working for you and your family, you're going to tell your friends, your neighbors, and so people accessed it. But now it's become so successful. It's probably going to be facing approximately a $245 million hole by the end of this session if we don't do anything. And again, this is the workforce behind the workforce. These are the people that make it possible for particularly women to be able to be in the workforce. And not only are they often, particularly with this subsidy, supporting women of color, the actual operators are disproportionately women, as well as immigrants and Black women and women of color. So it's on both sides of it, the people that are benefiting from the subsidy and the businesses that are receiving it. And we plug that hole because, again, you're not going to keep that low unemployment rate if people can't get to work, and they won't be able to get to work if their children can't be adequately, cared for in a safe place that they trust. And so those are kind of like urgent matters. Another, getting to my specific bills, there's a lot of resources that come down generally from the federal government to the state in terms of compensation for victims. Victims of crime oftentimes can get support for burial services, also support, mental health support for children and others that have been impacted. And then sometimes there are such situations where a victim, where there is domestic violence, or it could be community violence, where they need to maybe have some temporary housing out of community, whether that's a hotel or some type of temporary rental. And so there's two issues here. One, there's a lack of clarity about how much of this money is actually getting out to victims, because the path to access it can be so daunting that in many ways, if you are someone with limited means in the first place who actually can most benefit from it, you might not have the wherewithal to actually see the whole process through, because some people have had to engage even lawyers to get this. And so as you can imagine, that is a practice that is further traumatizing someone that has already been living through, victimization. But most importantly, it's like we need clarity about where the money is coming from. We need to streamline the process so it's not so daunting. But we also need to ensure that we're checking in on where the money's actually going. So there was a particular incident in my district where a young teenage young lady was sexually assaulted by a neighbor, and her family was being intimidated by friends of the alleged assailant. And so as you can imagine, this mother is trying to figure out how not only to keep her child safe, but also her other children who now feel a state of fear, not only for their sister, but for themselves, right? And so when someone has to leave their community, get a hotel, those bills rack up very quickly. And without immediate relief, we want to ensure that if people do incur some type of fees immediately in their own money, we need to be able to make them whole very quickly. It can't be 6 months, a year later, because I don't know how many of you, I can't wait 6 months to get paid back for something that was an unexpected, maybe multi-$1,000, expense. But I think all of us can relate to the feeling that I need to make my family safe. And if we have funds to support people through this and it's not getting it to them, we need to do something about that. The good news is that the governor's office wants to be a partner in streamlining the process. We put in a bill last session that didn't make it, but I think that having buy-in from the administration will help us expedite things. As I mentioned before, the Blueprint for Maryland's Future is definitely going to be a big premier policy effort to improve public education. It's not perfect, but it is definitely going to be providing support where there have been limited support. And in the last few minutes of session earlier this year, there was a bit of a fracas. There was a lot of arguing. There was a lot of things happening on the floor, and my bill was the next bill up, and it didn't make it out, but I have no worries. I think it will make it out this year, and it makes sure that every single district in the state has a dedicated professional whose sole job is the oversight and the implementation of the blueprint. Because right now, people are squeezing it in between other jobs and obligations, and I believe every district needs someone who that is their sole focus. And then two things, the quickest one first. Many of you know that I've put in a lot of bills that have to do with hair, including the Crown Act, apprenticeship bills around barbering, and as well as cosmetology. So because of that work, the Council of State Governments is working with over 20 states across the country to put in a cosmetology compact bill. And so what this would mean is that if you have a cosmetology license in any of those 20 odd states, then you can move there and you can do that job and it's honored the same. It's a little bit different than reciprocity. It's a higher form of recognition. And believe it or not, this was actually being done under the leadership of the Department of Defense, which might seem strange, but one of their concerns is that spouses of those in the armed services are often professionally unsatisfied. And if we can remove barriers, it would not only help that particular subset of the population, it would help people like, we're a small state. I'm sure if you wanted to do hair in Delaware, maybe you do it if this made it easier and safer for you to do. And then from a consumer protection side, if someone is giving people rashes and burning up necks across America, we should be able to have a database to know that so they can't just pick up shop and go somewhere else. And last but not least, how many of you are aware of the HBCU settlement bill from a few years ago? And I think many times they keep discussing the benefit of the bill is the $577 million settlement. But it wasn't just about the money that was supposed to be going to the institutions. It was about policy change around how we prevent institutions from duplicating programs that are unique and distinct to historically Black colleges and universities. So the money was supposed to help those HBCUs prepare those types of innovative and competitive programs. But we have to have policies that work with that funding to ensure that once they do create those programs, there's not another rash of duplicated programs. And so we'll be having, I think, our second to our last hearing on the 12th. It will be in person in Annapolis. And so the long and short of it is that, we will be right here 20 years from now with the same problem we just went through if we don't create a system that's fair, transparent, reliable, and predictable around how HBCUs and other schools in this country, in this state, determine the programs they want to introduce. The vast majority of collegiate programs that people come up with are not controversial, but when they are, they become very controversial. And so a recent example was there's a doctoral program that Morgan already had. It was a doctoral business degree that also had some emphasis on technology. And Towson was endeavoring to create a very similar program. And as you know, these aren't even schools very far apart. And so they were able to convince Maryland higher education commissioners in a meeting that no one could observe or get minutes of, that theirs was different enough. And we have no record of what happened there, but they approved it. Thankfully, through the advocacy of the Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland and many other stakeholders who were able to work with the AG's office, and eventually that particular ruling was undone. But we shouldn't have to have like a fire drill every time something happens. So that's why the work product of this, of this work group is to create a standard where you'll see. We need to have a path forward, because I'll tell you one of the biggest frustrations I have is traditionally white institutions will say, well, I attempted to collaborate with UMES, or I tried to collaborate, which means they sent one email one day to a person that has 15 jobs, okay? Meanwhile, they all have a lot more resources and many people dedicated to very discrete endeavors, and that's not what it looks like at most colleges. And so one of the things that we're going to be thinking about is to make collaboration real, you have to give resources, particularly to those institutions that do not have the same resources. So how can people partner if there's such a great imbalance? So some of the proposals we're considering will discuss collaboration funds, opportunities to ensure that HBCUs kind of get first. It's not the exact term of art, but kind of like first right of refusal, because if the whole premise of the HBCU settlement was that program duplication was both unreasonable and unnecessary in many instances, then we have to ensure that HBCUs have an opportunity first to develop these new programs, because if they're picking up the rear, it defeats the whole purpose of the settlement and the money that was attached to it. So I'll stop there, and I thank you for your time.
All right, so let's talk about the topic of juvenile justice. A lot of conversation about crime and young people. It's something that's been a big conversation in local corporate media. There have been a bunch of hearings in the House Judiciary Committee around juvenile justice. LBS has been very clear about our perspective, which is that a lot of the pushback that we're seeing on issues of juvenile justice have a lot to do with the fact that law enforcement, prosecutors are losing power in Annapolis. There was a time when prosecutors, law enforcement essentially were the gatekeepers of any policy that would happen in Annapolis. And when you think about the repeal of the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, passage of Anton's Law, the legalization of cannabis, the odor bill that was mentioned in the previous panel, the Child Interrogation Protection Act, these are all things that are chipping away at the power that prosecutors and law enforcement have over policy regarding criminal justice and law enforcement in Annapolis. So again, LBS has been pretty clear about that. My question for the two of you, and I'll add this, there was a Goucher poll that came out a few weeks ago, and there was a particular data point that I actually found to be the most fascinating, which is they say that of those they polled, 62% of Democrats favored laws that were more lenient as it relates to juvenile justice laws. and 62% of Black folks favor laws that were more on the side of accountability. Now, I find that the dichotomy to be a false one, right? Because those, even though we want to make sure young people have alternatives to incarceration, that doesn't mean we don't want folks held accountable, right? So I think that's a false binary. And I've already had conversations with legislators who have weaponized that data point as a way to justify they potentially siding with efforts to roll back juvenile and criminal justice policy. My question for you all, given the fact that you're both in different ways, differently positioned, in the different chambers, if you can talk about the ways that you think that the discourse in corporate media about juvenile justice, about the fact that, most of the media that I've seen over the past several months has really blamed, Senator Carter as like this architect of something that's, making young people run wild. Talk about how that's translating into conversations that are and give the listeners a sense of the real danger and the progress that has been made is under as a result of the propaganda that we're seeing in that direction.
Thanks, Davon. Again, that's a lot, and I could talk ad nauseum about it. But the first thing that is important is that much of the narrative that's been put forth in the media is a false narrative. It is simply untrue. What has been said about the laws that we passed is not true. But the issue that we have is that when someone that is in a position of authority with a law enforcement agency or a prosecutor says something, folks tend to believe it, even when the actual wording and language of the law contradicts what they have put forth, and that's what we've been experiencing. I believe that Davon is 100% correct. I think that from a couple of years ago, when we made significant changes to police accountability, many law enforcement agencies and officers in the FOP got very nervous, and now what's happening is kind of a spitefulness. We want to get our power back. And so that's a lot of what I think is behind. But I think it's important, Davon is correct. It's been very disconcerting to me that I've been suddenly made in many ways the face of this problem when I was a Senate sponsor of the same bill that the chair of the House Judiciary Committee sponsored, who happens to be a prosecutor outside of the legislature, and in no way could be considered to be in any way soft on crime. We needed to make major changes. We were the worst state in the country when it came to the overt criminalization of children, lengthy detentions, putting children in adult court, we still are, and not giving them any pathway really to rehabilitation. And so what the law that we passed does in no way, there's a couple of different ones. One of them is the Juvenile Reform Act. That bill was actually somewhat orchestrated through Governor Hogan's Department of Juvenile Justice. The council that was formed under that law met for 2 years. Law enforcement, this is very interesting. Law enforcement, as well as the prosecutors, the state's attorneys, were initially in favor of all of the recommendations of this council, which included taking children under the age of 10 out of the criminal process. It included children between the ages of 10 and 13 only being prosecuted when they committed an act which would have been a crime of violence. And then finally, you've heard a lot of things about no kids can be arrested, no kids can be detained, and no kids can be talked to. That's simply untrue. For a long time in this country, we've had something called the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. And so ever since Miranda versus Arizona, all over this country, law enforcement has been obligated to explain Miranda rights, the right to remain silent, the right to an attorney, the right to have an attorney appointed if you can't afford an attorney, the right to speak and the knowledge that anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. These are things we all know because we've seen it forever. So the data was, the research showed that overwhelmingly children and adults, but we're just focusing on children now, don't understand when a person in a position of authority, a police officer, has them under the hot lamps and slides a piece of paper in front of them saying, these are your rights, but you want to talk to us so you can go home, right? Which is a common way that police interact with children when they are suspects. children simply didn't understand what a right is, what a waiver is, or what their rights really were. So all the law does is simply ensure that children, before they would give up a right, would have it explained to them. It does not force them to remain silent. It does not force them to have an attorney present even during the interrogation. It simply says that before you take a statement from a suspect that is a child, they must consult with an attorney to have those rights explained to them. And what does that do? It's good for public safety, because so often persons that are initially arrested are the easy target. Not that they're the ones, the culprits, they're not always the guilty ones, they're the ones that were easier to get to. And so what this does is now allow for police to potentially not overcharge or hold someone that they don't have any evidence on, and force a confession from, because we have data all over Maryland where children overwhelmingly gave confessions to crimes they did not commit because they thought they could go home. So this makes sure that police can better pursue the actual suspects, the actual culprits. So it's a public safety bill, because when a wrong person is being held, the right people that might be out there being violent in the community are not pursued. So that's why it's important. But it's also important because if you have a child, you know how children are, right? You know that children will often agree to things because they want favor. They want to be liked. They want you to be proud of them. They want to, in these instances, they want to go home, and often they're told, you can be quiet and you're going to be held here. But if you talk, you sign this paper, you can go home. And so that's the danger. And many other states already had passed this law. So much of the narrative about it is false. But I think that one of the things that I would like to express is it's been most disconcerting to me to hear the demonization and hatred of children, especially those children in Baltimore City that have been decades upon decades victims of lead poison that has never been abated. They have had to navigate in a substandard educational system. They have had to endure no social activities, particularly in the pandemic era, but of the closing of recreation centers and the closing of all really social programs, and no investment in their communities. So you give them nothing, leave them to their own devices, and then want to say you're a criminal and you need to be locked up forever. So all the bill does is designed to build our children. Maryland doesn't have a death penalty, so ostensibly, majority of people that ever get arrested for anything are coming back into the community. It's our responsibility to make sure they have the tools they need, the rehabilitation tools, to be able to do so in a way that's in the best interest of the public. So that's a lot. You're right here.
You were like walking around in my mind the last thing you said about how we don't have the death penalty, but I was thinking a bit differently. We're just killing people slowly. Other people just get right to the point and kill you. It's just policy violence. It's still the same result of communities not being as vibrant and as whole as it could be because of the types of disinvestment that she just outlined. But I wanted to actually bring this back to the budget again, because under Hogan, there was really a disinvestment in the entire state law enforcement system altogether. So whether you're talking about probation, parole, corrections, any of the resources you could receive behind the wall, let alone once you got out. So when you have completely starved an already underfunded entity, but you've starved it even further of the resources it needs, that means that there's a direct relationship between the state law enforcement system not having the tools it needs and what happens in our communities. I mean, we've seen even through the homicide rates that nearly a third of those who have been killed and about a third of those who are alleged to be the perpetrators were under state, guidance at that time, or state custody and the state oversight at that time, rather. And so there is a relationship between the state not properly funding the law enforcement enterprise and what we're seeing in our communities. And that was Hogan just not investing in it. So now when you look at all Maryland state agencies, there's an average of a 13.4% vacancy rate across all state government. State government is literally limping along. And when you talk about, if you could be the best probation parole officer in the world, but if your caseload is of a certain magnitude, the ability for you to give careful oversight is obviously incredibly hampered. And this also affects the morale of those in the Department of Juvenile Services and in other roles that are supposed to be supporting our young people. But I also want to get back to Damon's original question about how are people reacting to the messages, particularly from media, that children are the problem. I always tell people that people love picking on people who can't vote, like kids and immigrants, right? Because it's easy. They feel that there's limited repercussions to demonizing them. And so I think that's happening here. I mean, when you look at the crime data, it's a bunch of grown people, very grown people that are causing most of the mayhem in our communities. But it's a lot easier for us to look at the children. But we're also looking at these children in isolation from the fact that there's some adult responsible for them. Like to her larger point, there's a deficit of support both from the government, but also in community to provide the support that young people need. But when it comes to at least my colleagues, I haven't heard, at least in my immediate circle, kind of a sympathy for some of these hardline rhetoric around juveniles, but I have heard some concerns about teasing out accountability when a violent crime is happening, when a weapon is being used. So I haven't heard a lot of details about where people want to go with that, but I think people are trying to create some level of boundaries around what type of juvenile crime they want to react to with certain levels of intensity. And I think as the session emerges, we'll get to see more about what that means, more specifically. But I think that another thing that is kind of the elephant in the room is that I think this is also a very intentional distraction from the fact that law enforcement, particularly police officers, are still resistant to having to comply with constitutional policing expectations, and also are seemingly resistant to the professionalization that is happening in their field. So take, for example, the state's attorney's citation docket, right? I know that there's probably very different feelings about, writing people up for largely nonviolent offenses. But what I think is most interesting is that the reason why many of these citation dockets aren't even happening are because the police aren't filling out the citations correctly. So, I mean, again, the professionalism within law enforcement, their ability to adhere to constitutional policing, it's like, let's distract from our ineptitude and our weak points to make it seem like all of the things that are happening wrong with criminal justice are happening over there. It's the judges, it's the prosecutor, it's a kid. But the ingredients of any case is the policing. If the policing isn't constitutional, if the chain of custody isn't defensible, if all of these things are falling apart, then a prosecutor can't make a case in the first place. And I think that those who are in prosecutors' offices, because the police are obviously their common coworkers and colleagues, they're not going to publicly kind of critique where they're falling short on the job because they feel like they need each other. But I think that is kind of going undiscussed in this larger conversation around police, is that even her bill that's basically saying respect the constitutional rights of children, these are not really new expectations, but the fact that they're being reacted to as if they're new is itself revealing about what they view their jobs to be and where the skills of many who are in these jobs are about what they should be doing.
All right, so what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna ask one more question and then open it up to the audience. One quick thing I wanna add on to it, to what's been said. Again, much of the narrative that is coming in opposition, on the opposite direction, in terms of juvenile justice reform legislation that was discussed, there's a very intentional, we look at Fox 45 and Sinclair Broadcasting, right? A very intentional interest. And when you think about the money interest and why do they care, right, about the narrative, right? I think they care because they have a political agenda, right, that has to do with undermining the humanity of people of African descent, which is consistent when understanding this larger system of racism and white supremacy, and we see it in every, arena of civil society. So just adding that. And so my last question, we have, I believe, the biggest Black caucus in the United States that continues to grow. We have a Speaker of the House of Delegates, the first Black person to be Speaker of the House of Delegates, and now we have a Black governor, right? Our first Black governor in the state's history. And just in my experience in doing legislative advocacy, having a large Black caucus is not necessarily translated to policy that impacts Black people, right? And so many of us have had to put pressure on the Black Caucus, in the past in order to get it to support the kinds of policies that we're talking about today. And I would say that, in addition to, the Black Caucus on many of these issues, having a greater voice, there's still, I think, work to do. But then when you add the element of having a Black governor on top of that, I think there are questions as to how effective will that be in making sure that Black people's needs will be more responded to, given the larger political climate. And I think there are arguments to be made on any direction of that. So my question is, what is your sense of the impact of having a Black governor on, like, many of the issues that we've talked about? Is it something that'll be more helpful in pursuing the interests of Black people? Or will it present a different set of challenges that'll be important for people to know about and think about? And what is it that support that you all would need in order to overcome whatever potential barriers may come as a result of having a Black governor, in addition to all the Black people that occupy positions of leadership?
I'm going to switch it up. So I grew up in Virginia, so I had a Black governor when I was a small child. So it's great, but it's not as novel to me. And then as we've lived through the Obama administration, people, I think, nationally got to at least feel what it was like to have a Black executive in charge. So even if your state didn't have it, people have at least lived through that, right? Which is very different than when Douglas Wilder became governor. There was nothing else even remotely similar, that had occurred. And so I say all this to say is that I was a public interest advocate on Capitol Hill when Obama was president. And I think not just Black advocates, I just think a lot of, progressive social justice advocates didn't know how to navigate it because they didn't want to necessarily be another impediment when they felt like this person was getting some unfair critique and unfair pressure. I think people just didn't know how aggressive to be. I think having lived through that time frame, people might not feel that same kind of pressure they felt then to be maybe more hands-off, right? That's the sense I get. People just feel like they still have a job to do. It's great to have a Black leader, but I don't think people feel like they have to muzzle themselves because this person is Black. And, you never know. Part of this could be also because our governor is entering his political life as governor. So he's not really building off of like a decade plus of political friendships with folks. So he doesn't have that practical, longevity of political relationships with people that could also maybe pull people back a little more, from saying what they really think. So I feel that people are expressing themselves the way they feel they need to express themselves. And I think something to remember is, unlike Congress with Obama, in Maryland, Democrats, I'm not saying Democrats are de facto, always going to have policies that support the Black interest, but when Democrats have a supermajority in the House and Senate, the leverage is a little different than when you're basically almost 50-50 or the other party's in charge. So he really can't, we could override any veto he would do. Like, I'm just being frank. There's just not that, there's more about, these are branches of government where they're co-equal, and I don't think, for example, I believe I see him as a colleague and a leader, but he is not my boss, and I don't think most people in the General Assembly view the governor as their boss. They might see the presiding officer of their chamber as more theoretically their boss, or perhaps the chair of the committees on which they serve, but I don't really think that people maybe feel like they need to edit themselves the way I think during the Obama administration and what we faced kind of as a country, being so novel, being so new to that dynamic. And that Black caucus, I'll be honest, the Congressional Black Caucus was older and probably a little more timid about being outwardly confrontational, but our Black caucus in the state of Maryland is younger and led by a younger person. And I think that is also a very different dynamic.
So I echo a lot of what Delegate Smith believes. I think it's a little too early to see what is going to come of the first Black governor in Maryland, and at the same time we have a Black woman who's the Speaker of the House and a larger legislative Black caucus than ever before. I have lived through something not exactly this, but similar, and I would point out that in my experience, while we aren't talking about a prior Black governor, when we talk about the Democratic Party, when we had a Democratic governor, we couldn't get the HBCU legislation passed. We couldn't get any police reform done. We couldn't get any criminal justice reform done. But the presence of a Republican governor, in my opinion, pressured Democrat leadership to go further on behalf of Black people in order to show that the Democrats are really the party of mercy and the party of the people. So I think that keeping that in mind, we have to be extremely cautious. I also believe that, if you look back to slavery times, you know that one of the ways that Black unity was divided, was lessened, is because you had, as Malcolm X and others have said, the house Negro and the field Negro. And so the dynamic of the Maryland General Assembly is that you're put in a position of leadership, and then your priority becomes furthering the policies and the agenda of the leadership. And oftentimes that's completely at odds with the best interest of Black people. And so as long as we kind of have the setup that we have, it's always going to be difficult, one, for the Black caucus to be unified on one issue. And, Delegate Smith may disagree with me, and I'm not even suggesting that this is the answer, but I'm just going to give an example, because I remember when, right after, we haven't even been in the legislation and the consent decree long on the HBCU issue, which was a decade-long litigation and a determination that our HBCUs were unconsciously underfunded for decades. And right after that, Towson and the Maryland Higher Education Commission are comfortable to pass, to vote in favor of program duplication. So my point is, that is indicative of the fact that it wasn't taken seriously. And I've suggested that given the Supreme Court ruling and where we're looking at in terms of affirmative action, especially in higher education, that you don't see a big movement afoot, for example, to codify HBCU equity in the Constitution, as we've done for other things that aren't specifically Black people, namely abortion. And I'm not saying the two are equivalent, but I am saying that when it comes to us, I do not see the level of urgency or steadfastness to ensure that we have our rights protected. I don't see it exactly the same as anything else. So all that being said, what we have to do is we have to rely on all of you and people outside the legislature to pressure your representatives to do the right thing and not kowtow to sometimes a leadership agenda that is contrary to the interests of Black people.
That was Hogan's Impact Commissioners did that.
All right, so we're gonna go to questions from the audience. We have a few minutes. I see a couple of hands, so I'm gonna start here and then I'm gonna go here.
Are they still there?
Hi, my name is Gwen Levi, and my question would be, I remember when we elected Obama, Black people got complacent to me, in my opinion, and we allowed us to think that we had arrived. But at the same time, we thought that we had arrived, keeping fighting to make sure that we didn't ever arrive. And I'm concerned that right here in Maryland, the same thing is happening with the media, with our, I don't want us to look back 10 years from now and say, and my grandkids say, Grandma, how did y'all fail? You had all them Black people in office. How did we not get better schools? How did we not get all our rep centers open? How do we not get these things? So that's my issue. I don't want us to be complacent thinking that because we have the largest Black legislative group right now, that our communities get complacent and think that, oh, everything's gonna be all right. No, it's not. You see what Fox News is out there doing. Our kids are beginning to be called predators again. We even have Black people pushing the issue of stronger, what do you call it? Stronger stronger sentencing and things like that. So I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that those legislators cannot do it by themselves, and that we as a community must go back out into our community and make sure that we tell the truth. We set the record straight. We don't let people continue to repeat Fox propaganda about our kids or about our community. So I just want us to let us know that we can't just rely on that we have the largest Black legislative, we had a black president. Come on, y'all.
So we're gonna go here and then we're gonna go back there.
I'm Stephen Wiley with the NAACP. Racism is systemic and institutional. So no matter who the face is, it can always be replaced, as we see at the UN General Assembly, where a black man is holding his hand up to continue the genocide of Palestinian children. And that voice is also seen here in the Baltimore metro region. Like 2 weeks ago, we sat down with the Annapolis Police Department. Their police presentation to us was how these specific black communities, the juveniles in the communities, were causing crime, were engaging in various criminal activities. And one of the things that I've tried to mention to them was that the humanizing presentation of black children leads to increased incarceration. And the way that they were describing black children was exactly how, the Palestinian children are being described. It leads to a genocidal activity. And it doesn't just occur in the city, it's throughout this region. So that was the first thing I want to say. The second thing I was wondering about was compliance from the police departments in regards to the Juvenile Justice Act and the police accountability boards. We did just have, it should be coming up, our first police trial board, not police trial board, but administrative hearing of a police officer in Anne Arundel County coming up. And so I encourage you all to be on the lookout for that. And whether or not our police departments are complying with the requirements of the Maryland Police Accountability Act and the Juvenile Justice Reform Acts. Are they sending the children that they've arrested? I don't even know what the process is in terms of what they're supposed to be doing if they are in the presence of a child that they believe is committing a crime. Like, what is the process for that? Are they sending these children's, the child's information to DSS, and then DSS can get involved? Is that the process of how it works? And are they being compliant?
So what I'm gonna do in the interest of time, so I'm gonna hold that. I'm gonna go back here and then come up here, and then you can answer whichever question is you feel most good to answer. So back here.
Yeah, thank you. I want to thank LBS for hosting this. It's been quite illuminating. I want to thank Senator Carter and Delegate Smith for making yourselves available. I'm sort of new to the legislative process, and if I heard correctly, you talked about applying pressure. Maybe this is kind of a general civics question, I don't know. Are there some particular committees that every bill must touch? And if so, what are those, so we can sort of have a sense of where we want to try to focus our efforts, or is it contingent? So for example, let's say I decide I want to pass a bill that makes lake trout, spaghetti, and caramel cake the meal of Maryland. Like, is that always going to touch rules? Is it always going to touch judiciary, or is it just pretend?
Right, and then last question here, and then you can take whatever question you want to.
So I got a question. As we talk about juvenile crime, studies show that if a sixth grader struggles and failed in math, he has a 60% chance of dropping out of high school. So I wanted to know, as a particular policy, as a form of juveniles being released from custody or a part of their adjudication, can we send them through some type of remedial math to strengthen them, so that way they won't continue to go back into society with a lack of confidence? Because a lack of confidence in academics shows that they have poor academic performance. So what can we do to adjust how students look at academics, or how can we adjust how they apply academics to help use that as a form of preventive care and committing crime?
So again, I'll ask you all to take whichever questions you want and tie into that just some concluding remarks. One of the things I'll say, and I'll start with the last question first, is that
One of the things that's really important in the function of the legislature is the distribution of resources. And one of the things that's really important is advocating where those resources should go. One of the things that LBS has been doing over many years is advocacy around public investment in grassroots Black-led organizations to be able to fill in the gap. I think too often you kind of traditional corporate white-led nonprofits are often the ones that get the majority of the resources. And I think we see that approach to funding services is not effective in terms of addressing many of these issues. So I think in general, it's important to think about building the infrastructure capacity and just general awareness of the folks that are engaged in that particular area of work, and then follow efforts to try, we talked about the blueprint earlier, follow efforts in terms of where resources are allocated. Because I think a lot of times, in the absence of a person or organization being represented in a certain context, resources are directed to people who know where the resources are, they know where those decisions are made, and so they make themselves available. So that's an addressing to that question. Again, you all can take whatever question and wrap into some concluding remarks.
Thank you. I think that, Stephen, your question really is a question that needs to be answered by legislative leadership, Department of Juvenile Service, and prosecutors across the country, across the state, because I think that your confusion echoes the confusion of so many, including people in law enforcement. Some officers have been misled about the laws and policies. So basically, a child under 10 years old cannot be charged. If that child is deemed to be a threat to himself or others, there are other mechanisms through Department of Health and Mental Hygiene or Department of Social Services that can immediately intervene and do what is necessary to provide for the safety of that child and or society. Children that are between the ages of 11 and 13 cannot be charged with a crime unless it is a crime of felony or crime of violence. There is an exception to detention, which is different than charges, if that child in that category has a gun. And then nothing that we did in the law really changes anything for children 13 to 17, except for misdemeanor offenses, they are to receive probation for 6 months, 12 months if it is a more serious crime that can always be reviewed by the court if there's a need to do something further. So there's a lot of nuances, but that's the gist of it. But there is nothing that prevents law enforcement from taking a kid off of the street or out of the school if that child is posing a threat to himself or herself or others. Nothing. But some people that think charging is the panacea are upset that the child can't be charged, but they're not utilizing the other tools. And finally, I'll say in Baltimore State, it was recently revealed in an article in the Baltimore Banner that under our state's attorney, more than 40% of cases of children charged or accused of honor theft, those kids who actually could be charged, okay, their cases were dismissed. I'll briefly touch on that. It's been the case for as long as I've been a lawyer, which has been almost 30 years. What happens is people, by the time a case comes up in court, which in juvenile court is very quick, but they usually have been made to some extent whole, meaning they either have paid their deductible and moved on. The bottom line is they don't want to take off work and come to court if they already got their car back or some compensation, which happens a lot through their insurance company. So often people that are the victims of auto theft simply do not choose to come to court, and prosecutors often offer dismissing or sets of cases because it's property crimes and not crimes of violence. That happens quite a bit. It's been happening for 30 years. Oh, real quick. So everything doesn't go through the same committee. For example, Delegate Smith is appropriations. I am judicial proceedings. I am all the criminal and civil law, and she's all the budget and money matters.
That's what I was going to answer. But what I think is important about this, though, I'm so glad you asked that question, is that there's kind of this tradition in the General Assembly to respect the work product of another committee, because they are the people closest to that subject area during the 90 days and what have you. And the reason why, I'm not saying that's necessarily problematic, but it can be problematic if people do not equip themselves independently to get up to speed on what's going on. So what I think has been really great is that I was first elected in 2018, so I'm in my second term, is that it's important for legislators to have friends on all the committees so that we can get together and see if there's any red flags that we need to apply pressure on. So for example, I used to be on Ways and Means for 3 years, and it has a really broad jurisdiction. It has all the election law, education policy, all revenues, taxation matters, and also gaming, anything lottery, gambling, what have you. So a lot of things that may not all seem to go together, but sometimes if something was coming up in another committee, people will let us know so that we can express things internally, and then vice versa. Someone on another committee might be concerned about something happening in our committee, and then they'll alert us because, for example, my background is environmental law. My background is not criminal law. So I actually understand more what's happening on the Environment and Transportation Committee, even though I'm not on it, just because it's my background. But so sometimes someone might have expertise that isn't on the committee, and then very often someone's on a committee that they have no expertise in. And so all of these things can be impediments to the best quality policy coming out. So I think it's important for you all to know that you don't just have to press on the people that are on that committee. Those are the people you should start with. But if you know that someone that represents you is a doctor or whatever, and there's a healthcare matter before health and government operations, they still have a platform. They're still a duly elected member of the General Assembly, and they have a right to talk to their colleagues from their professional or other form of expertise to share, their concerns. And we do that behind the scenes, but I wanted to let you know that could be another strategy. I mean, the U.S. Attorney, Eric Barron, used to serve with us in the General Assembly, and I think many people assumed he was on judiciary because he advocated successfully for so many justice bills, but it was just, no, he was just an experienced attorney, and he was on the health committee.
All right, let's give our two legislators a round of applause. So we're gonna wrap up. I wanna just, again, emphasize that it's really important that you support those in the legislative process that are advocating for us that can't do it alone. There are ways in which the efforts that we are trying to initiate, the things that they've talked about, there's opposition to it. And so it's our organized pressure that helps to provide the support that they need. Additionally, what I also want to say, LBS, as was mentioned by Adam in the beginning, is that we're a grassroots think tank. We're an organization that, we're LLC, we're a business, right? And that gives us a level of independence and gives us the ability to put pressure on legislators in a way that's very unique. A part of how we're able to do that primarily is two ways. One is folks becoming sustainers. So please sign up to give a monthly contribution to LBS to help power our work. And then also, if you can't contribute financially, also go to our website, sign up to be on our email listserv. Look out for our action alerts. I think sometimes it can be easy to underestimate the power of sending something to your legislator. That when legislators see people sending messages to their inbox, calling their offices, when they see that, it impacts them, and it helps us that are there in Annapolis give leverage to move legislators in our direction. So please sign up to be on our listserv to get all the information from Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Again, thank you all for being with us this afternoon and this morning. Safe travels. Have a good rest of your day.